Hey guys, picture this. You push open the creaking iron gate of a crumbling castle at midnight, the wind howling like a bad karaoke night, and a foul stew of moss and rot hits your nose. Yeah, it's basically nature's version of a perfume counter gone rogue. Before we dive into the grim legends of haunted UK and European strongholds, smash that like button if you love spooky history, and drop a comment telling us which ghost you'd most like to haunt your roommate. Dim the lights, maybe curl up with a blanket that's seen fewer centuries than these walls, because you're about to wander through stone corridors where torchlight flickers like a nervous Instagram influencer's selfie flash. You hear a distant clank. Is that a chain? Or just my imagination? And you can almost taste the cold iron of centuries-old armor clinging to the air, while the scent of damp stone battles the distant aroma of a modern espresso bar you just left behind. Imagine medieval knights whispering curses that would make your toughest Zoom call feel like a gentle hug, and ask yourself, would you rather face a ghost that demands a proper burial or a Wi-Fi outage in the middle of a live stream? Let's step into the gloom together, share a shiver, and see if the legends are more terrifying than your last Monday morning commute. When the fog-laden summer of 1347 rolled over the Shire, Elinor, bare-footed chronicler with ink-stained sleeves, trudged up the goat track that curled like a serpent around Ravenshoeld Castle. The stone keep rose out of the moor like a bruised thumb, its battlements clawing at the pewter sky. She smelled the sour tang of damp mortar and the distant, sweet rot of nettles that clung to the walls. A herd of midnight crows swooped past, cawing a warning that sounded suspiciously like a bad Wi-Fi connection. No signal. Yet her curiosity, as hungry as a teenage gamer for a new DLC, pushed her forward. At the great oak doors, a gaunt steward emerged, his cloak blacker than a tax collector's ledger, and his eyes hidden behind a pair of cracked spectacles. He introduced himself as Mortimer, the only living soul who hadn't fled the castle's whispered curses, though he swore he'd rather be a vampire than a historian. The air inside the hall reeked of smoked beef and the faint metallic sting of old blood, a scent that made Elinor choke on the dust of centuries. Mortimer gestured to a tapestry depicting the house's founder, a noble with a mustache as fierce as a dragon's tail, and muttered, "The Lord vanished, and the walls have been gossiping ever since." Elinor scribbled furiously, noting that the steward's humor was drier than the desert scenes in Game of Thrones. According to Mortimer, Lord Alaric, once a charismatic knight who could swing a sword like a rock star riff, disappeared on a moonless night, leaving only a cracked chalice and a half-finished ballad on the hearth. Villagers whispered that a curse had latched onto his bloodline, turning his heirs into specters who never learned to stop complaining about the weather. The steward showed Elinor a hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, each canvas covered in a fine film of grime that smelled like stale cheese left in a monastery pantry. As they passed, a low murmur rose from the stone itself, a susurrus like a gossiping aunt at a family reunion. Elinor felt a cold tickle down her spine, as if the castle were trying to tweet her a warning in medieval Morse code. Just as the candlelight flickered, the walls began to sigh, exhaling centuries of dust, mildew, and the faint perfume of forgotten feasts. The murmurs swelled into a chorus of restless spirits, their voices a mix of cracked medieval chanting and the occasional modern-day sigh, Think a haunted version of a choir auditioning for a reality show. Shadows slithered across the stone, curling like spilled ink, while a cold draft carried the metallic tang of rusted armor and the sweet rot of a dead rat that had apparently died on the throne. Elinor's quill clattered to the floor, knocked loose by an unseen chuckle that sounded oddly like a medieval version of a dad joke. She grinned despite herself, realizing that even cursed castles appreciate a good punchline. When dawn finally bled pink through the narrow arrow slits, the spirits retreated, leaving the castle sighing with exhausted relief, as if it had just finished a marathon of binge-watching ghost shows. Mortimer, looking as weary as a knight after a tournament of paperwork, handed Elinor a small vial of amber liquid. Rumor said it was ghost-proof gin, though he warned it might taste like regret. She tucked her notebook away, noting that history is less about dates and more about the smells that linger long after the page is turned. As she rode away on a creaky wooden horse, the castle's stones seemed to wave goodbye, their whispers turning into a cheeky see-you-later alligator echo. And thus, the tale of Ravenshold's whispering walls earned a spot in her chronicle, a reminder that even the darkest legends need a dash of laughter. Elinor slipped the crumbling parchment into her pocket and let the Highland wind yank the map's ink into spirals of gray. The road to Dunbury keep wound like a serpent through a veil of heather, each step muffled by the damp earth's sigh. As the stone tower loomed, its silhouette flickered against the mist like a bad Wi-Fi signal, half visible, half buffering. She felt the chill of centuries crawl up her spine, and a lone raven squawked a warning that sounded suspiciously like the opening line of a horror movie trailer. Pushing open the iron portcullis, Elinor stepped onto battlements slick with rain and the acrid tang of iron rust. There, ghostly warriors in faded tartans floated in a slow, eerie march, their swords clinking against invisible armor with the sound of dry leaves in a library. Their faces were pale masks, eyes hollow yet somehow scanning her like a security camera that had lost its power. A gust carried the faint murmur of an old Gaelic lament, making her wonder if the dead were rehearsing for a ghostly Eurovision. Without warning, the heavens burst open, hurling sheets of rain that pelted the stone like 1,000 angry drummers. Elinor scrambled for shelter beneath a shattered arch, feeling the cold droplets slam into her hair and seep into her boots, turning them into soggy, squelching prisons. Thunder roared, echoing the clash of spectral swords, and the scent of wet moss mingled with a surprising whiff of burnt peat, like a campfire gone rogue. She laughed nervously, shouting, "Even the heavens want a front row seat to this drama," while clinging to the crumbling stone for dear life. When the storm finally relented, Elinor's eyes fell on a massive tapestry hanging in the great hall, its red threads glistening like fresh blood in the candlelight. The scene depicted a clan chief shaking hands with a shadowy figure, the latter's cloak embroidered with a serpent that seemed to slither across the fabric. As she traced the pattern with a trembling fingertip, the hidden script emerged. "Betrayal binds the curse, blood for blood, silence for sighs." The realization hit her harder than a falling stone. Someone had sold the clan's soul for a whispered promise, and the ghosts were the unpaid debt collectors. She swallowed the metallic taste of fear, noting the irony that the very betrayal that birthed the hauntings now offered her a map out of the nightmare. Armed with the tapestry's secret, Elinor whispered the ancient verses, each word cracking the air like a broken record. The ghostly warriors halted, their swords lowering as if someone had pressed pause on an overdramatic opera. A spectral hand brushed her cheek, cold as a refrigerator door left ajar, then faded, leaving a lingering scent of lilac and old parchment. With the storm cleared and the keep's dark legend untangled, she slipped back into the mist, promising the Highlands she'd write the next chapter, preferably one with fewer undead and more tea. As she vanished, a lone gargoyle muttered, "Well, that's one way to ghost write history," and the wind carried her laughter back toward the hills. Elinor stepped off the ferry and into the mist-cloaked valleys of northern France, her boots sinking into the damp earth like a bad Instagram filter. The skeletal remains of Château de Noir rose before her, its cracked towers clawing at a sky that smelled of ozone and old stone. Vines strangled the battlements, and a sudden chill tickled the back of her neck, as if the castle itself were exhaling a sigh. She couldn't help but laugh at the thought that even ghosts must have had to navigate the same potholes in medieval times. A pale woman materialized in the central courtyard, her veil fluttering like a torn curtain in a Broadway drama. She wailed, her voice a mournful violin that reverberated off the crumbling walls, and tears, slick as moonlit rain, trickled down her translucent cheek. "My love was taken by the very stone you tread," she whispered, and Elinor felt the cold bite of centuries of unrequited longing. The spectral lady's lament turned oddly comedic as she muttered, "If only he hadn't joined the Ghostbusters," a fleeting nod to a pop culture legend amidst the gloom. Compelled by curiosity, Elinor slipped through a hidden doorway concealed behind a moss-covered statue of a lion, descending into the catacombs where the air tasted of iron and sour vinegar. Flickering torchlight revealed walls etched with alchemical symbols that looked suspiciously like bad teenage doodles of dragons and the occasional smiley face. In the deepest chamber, a rusted alembic sat beside a vellum scroll outlining a pact with a demon. Apparently, an over-ambitious medieval chemist tried to turn lead into love. The smell of rot and ancient parchment made her stomach churn, yet she couldn't resist the absurdity of it all. "Well, that's one way to avoid modern Tinder," she muttered. As the echo of her footsteps faded, the stone around her seemed to pulse, tightening like a conspiratorial hug from the castle itself. Shadows lengthened, forming silhouettes that resembled the infamous Inception's spinning top, urging her to question which reality she inhabited. The alchemist's curse crackled in the air, a faint hum that threatened to bind her forever to the dark, damp corridors. Elinor felt the pressure of unseen hands on her shoulders, as if the castle were trying to enroll her in a never-ending haunt college, majoring in perpetual terror. With a sudden burst of resolve, and a sarcastic shout of "Not today, spooky landlord," Elinor sprinted back toward the courtyard, the spectral lady's lament rising to a crescendo that sounded oddly like a choir of 90s boy bands. She burst through the hidden doorway just as the first rays of dawn pierced the gloom, the castle's grim silhouette fading like a bad Wi-Fi connection. The chill lingered, a reminder that darkness still whispered behind every stone. Yet as she boarded the ferry back to England, she carried with her a tale that would make any ghost story clubbers gasp, and perhaps, just perhaps, a new appreciation for the phrase, "no rest for the wicked." Elinor stepped off the rust-caked ferry onto the cold, sullen shingle of Blackthorn's shoreline, where the wind howled like an angry banshee over the cliffs. The keep loomed ahead, its stone walls streaked with moss and the faint scent of damp rot that made her throat tighten. She could hear distant clanks and moans, ghostly rehearsals of a siege that hadn't ended in centuries. With a half grin, she muttered that even the most persistent hauntings were better than her mother's nagging about proper tea etiquette. The night sky flickered, as if the stars were trying to send a Morse code warning, but Elinor marched on, lantern swinging like a nervous firefly. Inside the great hall, torches sputtered against a backdrop of stained glass ghosts, their colors bleeding into the stone like spilled wine. A spectral garrison marched in endless loops, swords clanging against phantom shields, the metallic tang of blood hanging thick in the stale air. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, yet every now and then one would grin a crooked, deadpan smile, an ironic nod to the absurdity of endless battle reenactments. Elinor ducked under a phantom lance that whistled past her ear, feeling the chill of ancient steel brush her cheek. It was as if she'd stumbled onto a medieval version of a Groundhog Day nightmare, only with more armor and less coffee. At the heart of the hall, etched into the floor, glowed a sigil older than the castle's foundation, its lines twisting like a miser's tangled beard. The pattern pulsed with a sickly violet light, humming a low, mournful chant that vibrated under Elinor's bones. Legend said the sigil was forged by a warlord who cursed his own men to replay their dying moments until a true soul broke the spell. Elinor realized that to shatter the loop, she would have to step into the sigil's center, becoming both judge and executioner of the lingering death. She swallowed a breath that smelled of iron and ancient incense, feeling the weight of centuries press against her own pulse. With a flick of her wrist, Elinor ignited a crystal lantern, its light cutting through the gloom like a lightsaber in a bad sci-fi parody. The spectral soldiers recoiled, their ethereal armor sizzling as the pure flame licked their forms, turning some into wisps of ash that drifted toward the vaulted ceiling. She wove through the battlefield, chanting an old hymn of sunrise while dodging a ghostly spear that sang, "You shall not pass," in a voice that resembled a medieval DJ. Each step forward felt like stepping on shards of broken mirrors, reflecting her own fears and the promise of losing her soul to the darkness. As the sigil cracked, a thunderous roar shook the stones, and Elinor felt a cold hand brush the back of her neck, an ominous reminder that death never forgets an invitation. When the final crack echoed, the sigil shattered into a spray of glittering shards that vanished like popcorn in a windstorm, and the phantom garrison dissolved with a sigh of relief that sounded oddly like a sigh after a long Netflix binge. The hall fell silent, the only sound now the soft drip of water from the stone ceiling, echoing like a calm after a storm of swords. Elinor emerged from the darkness, her clothes smeared with phantom blood, but her heart beating with a bright, stubborn defiance. She laughed, a hoarse, victorious chuckle, thinking how she just outwitted a centuries-old curse with the flair of a modern-day superhero. As she turned her back on Blackthorn Keep, the first rays of dawn painted the ruins rose gold, promising that even the darkest legends can be rewritten by a daring soul. When the ancient sigil finally cracked under Elinor's relentless hammer, the tormented echo that haunted the stone walls fell to a sudden, unnerving hush. The air, once thick with the sour stench of centuries-old incense and ghostly sighs, turned crisp as the first frost of dawn brushed the battlements. Crumbling parapets that had rattled with spectral footsteps now stood like skeletons of a once ferocious dragon, draped in ivy and cobwebs. Even the ravens, those perpetually sarcastic overseers, seemed to pause, their caws muffled by the weight of a silence older than the kingdom itself. Elinor, quill in hand and boots caked in mud, stalked the ruined corridors as if she were auditioning for a medieval version of Ghostbusters. Minus the proton packs, plus a lot more parchment. She whispered the forgotten names of lords and ladies into the cold stone, each syllable coaxing a flicker of light from the shadows like fireflies at a summer fair. As she wrote, the restless spirits clutched their old grievances, and with a collective sigh that sounded suspiciously like a collective, finally, slipped free, drifting out through the broken windows like smoke from a chimney. The castle's once ominous groans turned into chuckles, as if the ghosts were grateful to be let out of their stone-sized airbnb. With a flourish that would make a medieval scribe jealous, Elinor sealed the dark legends into leather-bound tomes, binding them with wax seals stamped with a laughing skull, a nod to the mischievous imp that once hid in the pantry. She tucked the volumes into a hidden alcove beneath the great hall, where the scent of damp stone mingled with the faint aroma of ancient pine, a reminder that even legends need a comfortable reading nook. As each story snapped shut, the castle seemed to inhale, its crumbling arches settling like an old man finally finding his favorite chair. The irony was palpable. The very walls that once nurtured terror now housed the cautionary tales like a library of horror movies, ready for future generations to binge-watch. The first rays of sunrise slithered over the jagged silhouette of the ruined keep, painting the broken battlements in a molten gold that made the stone sparkle like a freshly polished shield. The chill of the night gave way to the warm breath of morning, carrying the scent of wet earth and a distant whiff of roasted chestnuts from a nearby village market. Birds, perhaps unaware of the night's drama, sang a jaunty tune that sounded oddly like a medieval version of a pop anthem. Think Eye of the Tiger, but with lutes. Shadows retreated, pulling back like stagehands after a dramatic performance, leaving the castle's scars illuminated, honest, and oddly hopeful. And so, with the sun climbing higher, Elinor stood atop the highest turret, feeling the wind ruffle her cloak like a curtain call applause. The haunted realm, once a nightmare spun in stone and blood, now resembled a once-forgotten museum, still gritty, still a bit smelly, but undeniably safe for tourists and curious kids alike. She promised the lingering spirits, and the occasional nosy historian, that the stories would live on, not as curses, but as cautionary tales fit for a bedtime binge on Netflix. In that golden light, the ruined walls whispered a quiet, ironical truth. Even the darkest legends can find peace when someone dares to write them down and let the sunrise do the rest. Brother Edric trudged up the moss-slick path that wound like a tired snake around St. Aldrich Abbey, his sandals sloshing through puddles of goat milk and rain. The stone walls rose out of the mist, their gray faces pocked with lichens that looked like the fingerprints of ancient giants. A cold wind whispered through the cracked windows, tugging at his cassock as if the building itself were breathing. He glanced back at the low hills of the Welsh borders, where sheep grazed like fluffy clouds in a somber sky. The scent of wet stone and fermented honeycomb filled his nostrils, a welcome for a man accustomed to the smell of incense and ale alike. At the great wooden doors, Abbot Rowan greeted him with a stare as sharp as a monk's crozier, his eyebrows knit into a permanent frown that could have scared a dragon. "Welcome, Brother Edric," he intoned, his voice echoing off the stone like a church organ out of tune. The abbot's robes were so austere they made even the most minimalist monk blush, and his sandals squeaked on the flagstones with the dignity of a tax collector counting coins. Edric tried to crack a joke about the abbot's sternness, but the old man only raised an eyebrow that said, "I was a joke before the joke became me." The air smelled faintly of lavender soap, an ironic touch in a place where the only other fragrance was the lingering odor of stale fish stew. Myra, the novice, floated into the cloister like a wisp of parchment caught in a sudden gust, her eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight as if she'd been reading comic books in the dark. She introduced herself with a shy smile, then disappeared behind a column, only to reappear moments later, clutching a feathered quill that seemed to hum with an unseen power. The walls around her seemed to shudder, sending a chill that brushed the nape of Edric's neck like a phantom hand. She whispered a prayer so low it sounded like a secret password for a medieval speakeasy, and the stone floor rattled as though some ancient beast were shifting its weight. The scent of damp parchment and old leather books mingled with the lingering smell of burnt incense, creating a heady perfume that made Edric wonder if the monastery had a hidden bakery. Soon, the abbey's famed quiet was pierced by strange drafts that slipped through cracks like mischievous sprites, carrying with them the sound of distant chanting that seemed both ancient and oddly familiar, like a Gregorian chant sampled in a modern EDM track. The monks' whispered prayers rose in unison, forming a chorus that made the stone arches tremble, as if the very architecture were auditioning for a horror movie. A frosty breath brushed Edric's cheek, leaving a translucent pattern that resembled a medieval sigil, perhaps a warning or a doodle from a bored scribe. The taste of iron crept onto his tongue, reminding him of the old legends of curses that turned monks into statues of salt during midnight feasts. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Edric couldn't help but grin at the absurdity of being haunted by a curse that sounded like it was scripted by a bored playwright on a rainy Tuesday. As night settled, the silent abbey seemed to hold its breath, its corridors echoing with the soft thud of a lone monk's heartbeat, like the bass line in a low-key thriller. Edric stood under the vaulted ceiling, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down like a heavy tome he hadn't read yet. He chuckled, thinking of the abbot's stern stare and Myra's mysterious grin, and wondered if the curse was simply the monks' collective insomnia. In that moment, the cold drafts turned into a gentle lullaby, coaxing the stone walls to sigh and the candles to flicker in applause. With a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a modern sigh of relief after a marathon gaming session, he whispered a prayer of thanks, hoping the ancient spirits would appreciate his sense of humor. Under the moon-slivered arches of St. Cuthbert's Abbey, Edric and Myra crouched like two medieval detectives, ears straining for any clue. The night air smelled of damp stone and stale ale, but it was the eerie chant of spectral monks that sliced through the silence. Their voices rose in Latin, Domine, Miserere, as if the choir had been stuck on a looping Spotify playlist from the 12th century. Each syllable dripped with cold, making the hairs on Myra's arms stand like a medieval hairdo gone rogue. Edric, clutching his lantern like a trusty sidekick, muttered that even the ghosts seemed more punctual than the brothers' morning prayers. Just beyond the cloister, a single candle burned with a flame that refused to surrender to wind or time. It flickered amber, casting shadows that danced like mischievous pixies across the stone floor, yet the wick never shortened. When Edric reached out, the wax felt warm as a fresh baked scone, and the scent of beeswax mingled with the sour odor of centuries-old incense. Myra joked that they'd found the medieval equivalent of a never-ending battery, but the candle's steady glow felt more like a nervous eye of a lurking spirit. They tried to snuff it with a cloister's damp rag, but the flame huffed back, chuckling in a whisper that sounded suspiciously like a modern-day meme. "I'm not dead, just on fire." Following the phantom light, the duo discovered a narrow stairwell hidden behind a faded tapestry of Saint Benedict. The steps creaked like an embarrassed goat, and each footfall sent a puff of mildew-laden air up their nostrils. At the bottom, a stone door yawed open to reveal a crypt, so cramped it made the refectory's pantry look like a palace ballroom. Bones littered the floor like a macabre jigsaw puzzle, and the smell of rotting vellum and old garlic turned Myra's stomach into a medieval battlefield. Edric swore he heard a faint clank, the echo of armor that had never been forged, hinting that some restless soul still guarded its own grave. They lit their lanterns, which sputtered as if trying to protest the crypt's oppressive gloom, and stepped deeper into the darkness. Just as the crypt's gloom threatened to swallow them, a figure in a crisp white habit slipped through the doorway, chanting a French lullaby that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke rendition of La Marseillaise. It was Pierre Luc, the prickly prior from the sister priory across the channel, who arrived with a weather-worn satchel full of warnings. He warned that a vengeful spirit, once a monk named Brother Aldrich, cursed after a particularly disastrous wine-making experiment, had taken up residence in the very stone they trod. Luke's eyes glittered with a mix of dread and amusement, as if he'd just seen a ghost flick a middle finger at him. He brandished a relic, a rusted iron cross that smelled faintly of rust and old cheese, as a talisman, insisting it could keep the angry specter at bay. Edric raised an eyebrow, noting that the French monk's dramatic flair made him look like a medieval rock star with a holy backstage pass. The night wound down with the candles still blazing, the ghostly choir humming off-key, and the crypt echoing with the faint clatter of phantom potsherds. Myra, now half convinced that the monks were rehearsing for a supernatural talent show, teased Edric about auditioning for Ghosts Got Talent. Pierre Luc, still clutching his iron cross, muttered that the vengeful spirit might simply be upset about unpaid rent on its eternal lease. Yet as a cold draught slipped through the cloister's arches, the monk's chant rose to a crescendo, and a sudden chill wrapped around the trio like a medieval hug from the afterlife. Even the stone walls seemed to sigh, reminding them that history isn't just dusty parchment. It's a living, breathing, and occasionally snarky roommate. With a shared laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, they agreed to meet again at dawn, armed with more candles, a better playlist, and perhaps a ghost-approved subscription to Netflix. The trio slipped through the cloister's cracked arches, their lanterns trembling like nervous toddlers. A hushed chant rose from the choir stalls, echoing off stone that smelled of damp wool and old incense. In the sacristy, they uncovered a silver chalice glinting with a cold fire, its surface etched with the name of Saint Aldrich. Little did they know the cup had been pilfered from an Italian shrine centuries ago, and it hummed with a secret as stubborn as a medieval Wi-Fi password. Visions of pale monks flickered in the corners, their eyes hollow pits that seemed to suck the candlelight. The chalice's curse whispered that any vow broken would tether a soul to the glass, turning repentance into perpetual haunting. As the specters grew bolder, they rattled chains, slammed wooden doors, and sprayed the air with the acrid scent of rot and spilled ale. One ghost, draped in a tattered habit, lunged with a sigh that sounded oddly like a bad karaoke note. The trio felt the chill crawl up their spines, realizing the relic was not just a relic, but a haunted Instagram filter for the afterlife. The monks, gaunt and weary, gathered in the refectory to debate their grim procurement, their whispers punctuated by the clatter of pewter plates. Father Bernard, whose beard could hide a small mouse, argued that returning the chalice to its Italian home would lift the curse, citing an ancient manuscript that read, "Where the wine flows, the dead shall not cling." Brother Hugo, ever the cynic, quipped that the relic was just a fancy way of saying bad plumbing, and suggested they sell it on eBay to fund a better roof. The trio, caught between holy duty and the temptation of modern resale platforms, joked that even the devil would need a VPN to navigate these medieval servers. Yet the growling of a specter near the kitchen, accompanied by the sour smell of burnt toast, reminded them that ghosts do not respect return policies. After a midnight prayer session that sounded like a heavy metal choir, they devised a plan to smuggle the chalice back across the Alps, disguised as a pilgrim's laundry basket. They wrapped the cup in coarse wool, scented with rosemary and a pinch of garlic to keep the wandering monks at bay. When the night guard, a hulking figure named Gunter, tripped over the basket, the silver clinked like a rogue cymbal, startling both living and dead alike. The spectral monks erupted in a chorus of wails that could have powered a medieval windmill. But the trio pressed on, their resolve steeled by the promise of less haunting and more fresh air. The relic's secret finally unfurled as they reached the marble steps of the Italian shrine, where a marble angel blinked and muttered, "Finally, someone who respects my Instagram caption." As the chalice was set upon the altar, the cursed whispers ceased, and the air filled with the sweet perfume of lavender and triumph. The specters dissolved into a soft, shimmering mist, leaving behind a faint echo of a monk humming, "Never gonna give you up," oddly appropriate for a tale of perpetual loyalty. The trio stood, dripping with sweat and holy water, realizing they had saved more than a relic. They had rescued a whole chain of afterlife gossip. And somewhere, back at the English abbey, the remaining monks whispered that the chalice's silver sheen now reflected a new, brighter future, free of ghostly Wi-Fi dead zones. When the lunar eclipse swallowed the moon whole, Mara and Tomas felt the world tilt into a cold, silvery hush. They descended the rust-capped stairway that spiraled into the submerged cavern, each step echoing like a drumbeat against ancient stone. The water smelled of brine and old rust, a pungent perfume that clung to their throats. Light from their torches flickered against kelp-woven walls, casting shadows that danced like ghostly marionettes. The cavern's mouth yawned ahead, a maw of darkness waiting to swallow their resolve. A sudden chill sharpened the air as Captain Vane's wraith materialized, his spectral coat flapping in a wind no one could feel. His eyes glowed with the sickly green of sea foam, and his voice rasped like a pirate radio station stuck on static. "Ah, the brave fools finally come to claim my treasure," he sneered, the irony as thick as the algae coating the stone. Mara drew her blade, its edge humming with a thin ribbon of moonlight, while Tomas readied the blessed lantern, its flame a defiant candle in a storm. The captain's ghost lunged, his spectral hook clanking against the cavern ceiling with a sound like a cursed piano key. From the abyss surged angry sea specters, hulking silhouettes of kelp wrapped wreckage and phosphorescent eyes that flickered like nightclub strobes. They roared, a chorus of bubbling anger that slapped the water against Mara's face, tasting of iron and old seawater. Light exploded as Tomas flung the pearl of moonlit glass into the maelstrom, its luminescence slicing through the darkness like a lightsaber on a foggy night. The specters recoiled, shrieking as the pearl's glow turned their ooze-filled forms to vapor, while Captain Vane hissed, his wraithy form trembling. A fierce battle of light against darkness raged, each clash sending ripples of foam that smelled of burnt salt and desperation. With a thunderous crack, the pearls shattered, scattering shards of moon-kissed glass like glittering rain across the cavern floor. The curse that had bound the fortress for centuries snapped, sending a shockwave that knocked the specters flat and sent Vane's wraith spiraling into the void, with a theatrical wail reminiscent of a badly timed soap opera exit. Yet victory tasted bittersweet. Tomas felt his legs go numb as the water surged, a cold that seeped into his bones like a bad hangover. Mara clutched her side, where a jagged shard had cut deeper than any sword, the pain a reminder that curses never give without a price. In that moment, the cavern seemed to sigh, exhaling centuries of grief as the sea settled into a mournful lullaby. When the waters finally calmed, the two survivors emerged, dripping and drenched in triumph and blood, like characters straight out of a gritty Netflix series about cursed pirates. They stared at the cracked shoreline, the moon now a thin crescent grin, and couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of fighting ghost captains with a broken pearl, something straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon. Mara muttered, "We just pulled a full-on Pirates of the Caribbean, but with fewer parrots and more existential dread." Tomas, nursing his wound, replied, "Next time we just ask for a map and a coffee, not a lunar eclipse." Their boots sank into the sand, leaving a trail of footprints that would soon be washed away, as if the sea itself were erasing any proof that they had ever faced the night's haunted showdown. When the gleaming relic slid back into the marble niche of Sienna's cathedral, a gentle sigh seemed to rise from the ancient stones, as if the building itself let out a breath it had held for centuries. The ghostly processions that once rattled the cloisters of St. Aldrich Abbey dissolved like mist at sunrise, leaving only the faint scent of incense and wet stone. The monks' spectral chanting faded, replaced by the rustle of parchment and the clatter of wooden shutters in the morning breeze. Even the resident raven, who had claimed the highest tower as his personal perch, gave a bemused caw that sounded suspiciously like a modern meme's laugh track. Edric, his eyes still wet from the night's spectral showdown, stood amid the now silent cloister and declared, "I shall stay and steer this ship of souls," a declaration that earned a chuckle from the senior monk who whispered, "Better than a Netflix binge, eh?" He brushed ash from his habit, feeling the gritty residue of centuries of candle wax on his fingertips, and imagined himself as a medieval version of a reality show host, only with fewer commercial breaks. The sun painted gold on the cracked frescoes, and the choir's ghostly harmonies were replaced by the lively hum of monks polishing brass candlesticks. Edric felt a strange thrill, like a knight who had just swapped his sword for a coffee mug, yet he was ready to wield his new authority with both reverence and a dash of sly mischief. Myra, the keep alive of the Abbey's memory, slipped into the dim library, where scrolls smelled of mildew and old leather, and gently placed a new vellum ledger beside the ancient chronicles. She whispered to the empty arches, "We will remember, even if the specters decide to ghost us again," and laughed, aware that the phrase now had a double meaning in the age of social media. Her fingertips brushed the cool stone, feeling the lingering chill of vanished footsteps, and she imagined the monk's sighs turning into a soundtrack for a Spielberg epic. If only Spielberg liked candle smoke. With each entry she recorded, she stitched the past into the present, ensuring that future pilgrims would hear the Abbey's stories over the clamor of modern traffic. Pierre-Luc, his habit dusted with the faint perfume of rosemary and stale ale, slung his battered satchel over his shoulder and took the winding road toward the Alpine passes. He sang a low hymn that rose above the crunch of frosted gravel, his voice echoing like a troubadour on a late-night tour bus. The monk's phantom banners waved in his mind, each one a reminder that the tale of haunted halls was now his passport to every cloister from France to the Czech lands. He imagined the ghostly monks waving at him from the train windows of a modern Eurostar, a sight that made him grin despite the cold bite of the mountain air. As the sun finally lifted over the Abbey's scarred walls, painting the courtyard in a honeyed glow, the living and the departed settled into a new rhythm. The monks resumed their humble chores, sweeping stone floors, grinding grain, and polishing brass, while the occasional chuckle drifted from the refectory, recalling the night's spectral drama like an old sitcom rerun. Edric, Myra, and Pierre-Luc each felt a quiet pride, as if they had just completed a grand quest without the usual loot, only a richer legacy. And somewhere, perhaps in a hidden cell, a mischievous specter still tapped a ghostly key on an ancient organ, reminding everyone that even in peace, a little haunt can keep the heart beating. The first light of dawn barely pushed through the iron-gray fog that clung to Eldoria's crumbling battlements. Servants shuffled like ghosts, their boots squelching in the damp stone, while the palace kitchens belched a stew of turnip and regret. In the great hall, tapestries depicting victorious ancestors swayed like nervous toddlers in a windstorm. Yet beneath the pomp, a low murmur rose, rumors of a cursed relic that had survived a dozen dynasties, like a bad sequel nobody wanted. The air tasted of mildew and burnt incense, a perfect perfume for a story about to turn dark. Prince Alaric, whose hair fell in a rebellious mess like a teenage rock star, slipped into the forbidden west wing out of sheer curiosity. He brushed aside a spider-shaped curtain and found an ancient chest, its iron hinges screaming like a squeaky horror movie door. Inside lay the black crown, blacker than a midnight espresso and pulsing with a faint, sour smell of rotting grapes. When his fingers brushed the cold metal, a shiver ran up his spine that rivaled the thrill of opening a loot box in a video game. The court's aging chronicler whispered, "Beware, lad, those who wear it end up as tragic as the last season of Game of Thrones." And Alaric could only grin nervously. Legends said the crown had been forged in the fires of a doomed rebellion, its gold stolen from a rival kingdom's treasury, and then cursed by a scorned witch. The curse, according to the oldest parchment, turned every wearer's victories into hollow echoes, like applause in an empty theater. Alaric lifted the crown, feeling the weight of 1,000 dead hopes press against his brow, while the stone floor creaked under the tension of unseen ghosts. A sudden gust rattled the candle flames, casting monstrous shadows that danced like badly animated CGI dragons. He slipped it onto his head for a moment, only to hear the distant toll of a funeral bell that smelled faintly of wet wool and sorrow. Meanwhile, the kingdom's council hustled to arrange the marriage between Alaric and Lady Seraphine of House Thornbridge, a union meant to stitch together two feuding houses like a badly sewn quilt. Servants polished silverware until they shone like the eyes of a cat eyeing a laser pointer, while the kitchen girls argued over whether to serve roast boar or quinoa. Yes, even medieval courts tried to be trendy. The air was thick with perfume, but also with the sour stink of political intrigue, as diplomats whispered behind tapestry seams, their voices as thin as moth wings. Alaric, still half-crowned, tried to hide his trembling hand behind a goblet of spiced wine that tasted like cinnamon-laced regret. The irony was as obvious as a billboard, a cursed crown at a celebration designed to end curses. As twilight settled, the courtyard filled with fiddlers whose strings sang a tune both mournful and oddly reminiscent of a pop-rock ballad, making the nobles sway like emojis at a party. The black crown, now resting on a velvet cushion, seemed to inhale the lantern light, its surface rippling like a pond disturbed by a careless duck. Alaric stood at the threshold, feeling the pull of destiny as palpable as the scent of wet parchment and roasted pork on his nostrils. He wondered whether to don the crown before the ceremony, risking doom, or to toss it into the moat where the water smelled like iron filings and teenage rebellion. The courtiers held their breath, their hearts thudding like drums in a cinematic climax, waiting to see if the veiled dawn would bring a new era or merely a darker sequel. The great hall of mirrors, where chandeliers once threw diamonds onto polished marble, now shivers under a veil of dust. Alaric's sister, Lady Selene, stalks its echoing corridors, clutching a silver locket that throbs with ghostly whispers of blood-stained ancestors. Each night the mirrors flash crimson silhouettes, her forebears in torn banners, eyes hollow like the Instagram filter, blood moon gone rogue. She swears the reflections bleed onto the floor, staining the marble with a scent of iron and old regrets. Her trembling voice rises in a lament that would make even Shakespeare roll his eyes at the melodrama. Beyond the gilt walls, the kingdom gnaws on ash and empty granaries, the fields cracked like old parchment. A relentless plague curls through villages, its coughs sounding like a brass band gone flat, while rats perform acrobatic ballets over famine-stained streets. The curse spreads like gossip at a royal banquet, turning hopeful peasants into gaunt spectators of their own demise. Alaric watches from the castle ramparts, his beard streaked with sweat and ash, wondering if history ever warned them about cursed bloodlines. Even the court jester tries to joke, but his punchlines land heavier than a sack of potatoes in a mud pit. Desperate, the siblings pack a meager rations cart, hard cheese, stale bread, and a flask of water that smells faintly of mildew, and set out for the ruined abbey of Ravensgate. The road winds through fog-kissed lowlands, where every croak of a toad feels like a warning from an unseen audience. Their horses knuckle down the muddy trail, hooves splashing through puddles that smell of rot and forgotten prayers. Selene clutches her locket tighter, as if it were a remote control for the curse's volume knob, while Alaric mutters about needing a GPS that even the Dark Ages would envy. By twilight they reach the abbey's shattered arches, a place where the wind whistles like a wind instrument solo gone off-key. Ravensgate looms like a Gothic Instagram filter gone wrong. Crumbling stone, vines that hiss, and stained glass windows cracked into a kaleidoscope of gloom. Inside, a reclusive mystic named Morwen sits cross-legged on a mat of moth-eaten tapestries, humming a lullaby that sounds suspiciously like the theme from a medieval video game. The air tastes of damp mortar and burnt incense, a perfume that could convince even the strongest knight to cough dramatically. Morwen lifts a candle, its flame flickering like a nervous tick-tock star, and eyes the siblings with a mix of curiosity and weary amusement. She jokes that the only thing scarier than curses is trying to explain them to a council of nobles, who still think the plague is just a bad case of the common cold. With a grin as crooked as the abbey's arches, Morwen declares that the curse feeds on denial, much like a toddler feeds on candy, both sweet and disastrous. She hands Selene a shard of cracked mirror, insisting it will reflect the truth if she dares to stare long enough, which, she warns, might cause her eyes to water like a leaky faucet. Alaric receives a vial of broth that smells of rosemary and hope, a rare commodity in a land starved of optimism. As they depart, the mystic tosses a cryptic line. The blood of kings may stain the stones, but only love can wash it clean, unless you prefer a Netflix binge of tragedy, in which case, good luck. The siblings stride back toward the hall, shadows dancing behind them, ready to face the mirrors with a mix of dread, humor, and the faint hope that even cursed royalty can pull a comeback worthy of a season finale. In the flickering torchlight of the palace's secret chamber, the court mystic unrolled a brittle parchment blackened with ancient ash. He whispered of a centuries-old blood pact sealed with a banished sorceress named Myrla, whose name still curdles milk in the kitchens. The pact, he warned, shackles the royal line to a curse that turns triumph into tragedy faster than a plot twist in a Netflix series. Alaric, the young king, leaned forward, his chin dripping with sweat and his crown a bit crooked from the heat. The mystic's voice crackled like a cursed radio, promising that only a shattered relic can shatter the curse's chain. Alaric rose from his throne, his boots echoing on the marble like thunder over a battlefield of paperwork. He grasped the mystic's warning. The relic lay hidden among the ruins of the House of Vailmer, a place rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a wine-dripping banquet that never ended. The kingdom's chroniclers had long dismissed the tale as gossip, but the smell of rot and old incense drifting from the royal archives convinced Alaric that the story was as real as the cobwebs on his crown. He swore an oath louder than a tavern brawl, promising to retrieve the fragment and end the blood-soaked drama. The court murmured, some with hope, others with the same indifference you'd find in a Monday morning Zoom call. The path to Vailmer's desolate halls wound through a forest that hissed with the cries of nightjars, and the stench of damp moss clinging to Alaric's armor like an unwanted souvenir. When he stepped into the ruined courtyard, broken statues stared with blank eyes, their stone faces splattered with a graffiti like ichor that glistened in the wan moonlight. The wind carried the metallic tang of rusted iron and the faint, sickly sweet perfume of wilted roses that once adorned the ballroom. Alaric's fingers brushed a shattered altar, feeling the cold shards bite into his palm like the bite of a bad haircut. He could hear his own heartbeat ricocheting off the cracked walls. a drumbeat that sounded suspiciously like the intro to a fantasy video game. Back at the palace, the council, a motley crew of advisors who looked like they'd been cast from a medieval version of a reality TV show, began to whisper about Alaric's reckless quest. Sir Gavril, whose ambitions smelled of cheap leather and ambition, tried to sway the king with promises of a quick fix that involved summoning a dragon from a souvenir shop. Lady Myrle, ever the cynic, offered to sell Alaric a miracle potion that tasted like mud and regret, insisting it would save the throne and his hairline. Their betrayals unfolded like a slapstick comedy, complete with spilled ink, shattered goblets, and a rogue pigeon that drooled on the royal seal. Alaric, however, laughed, a short, barky sound that echoed off the stone corridors, because nothing screams confidence like a monarch who knows his counsel is a walking punchline. When Alaric finally reached the heart of Vailmer, he found the relic, a crystal shard the size of a dragon's claw, nestled in a bed of rotting tapestries and skeletal chandeliers that swayed like tired dancers. He lifted it, and the stone sang a low, mournful note that resonated through his bones, reminding him of the first time he tried to ride a horse without a saddle. With the shard clutched tight, he sprinted back to the palace, dodging betrayals and doddering courtiers like he was on a high-speed chase scene from a spy movie. At the altar, he placed the crystal onto the ancient sigil, and the cursed veil lifted with a sigh that smelled of fresh rain after a drought. The kingdom breathed a collective exhale, and Alaric realized that sometimes breaking a curse is just a matter of finding the right piece of broken glass and having the guts to hold it up to the light. The night the crown bleeds began with a sky cracked open by a furious storm, hail rattling the stone arches like angry drumbeats. Alaric stood before the trembling altar, his cloak slick with rain, and slipped the ebony crown onto his brow, feeling its cold weight like a whisper from the grave. The crowd gasped, their faces illuminated by intermittent lightning that painted the hall in ghostly blues and sickly greens. A scent of wet wool and burnt incense swirled together, reminding even the most stoic nobles of campfires gone wrong. Somewhere in the back, a scribe muttered a prayer that sounded suspiciously like a bad karaoke version of Bohemian Rhapsody. From the crown's darkest corner rose the sorceress's spirit, a shimmering veil of midnight mist that hissed like a kettle left too long on the stove. She tilted her ethereal chin and snarled, "You think a pretty metal hat can stop me?" A line straight out of a poorly subtitled anime villain. The thunder roared in approval, and the palace chandeliers flickered as if the ghosts were swapping playlists. Alaric clenched his fists, feeling the crown pulse like an over-caffeinated heart, and shouted a challenge that would have made a medieval rapper proud. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and old parchment, making everyone's mustaches twitch in protest. Suddenly, the ancient walls erupted in a blaze of sapphire flame, licking the vaulted ceilings and turning marble into molten chocolate. Spectral armies marched out from the shadows, their armor clanking with the sound of 1,000 broken teacups. They clashed with the living guards in a cacophony of swords, screams, and the occasional guttural laugh that sounded oddly like a YouTube prankster. Sparks rained down like fireflies on a bad Halloween night, and the scent of scorched leather mixed with the sweet rot of overripe grapes from the banquet tables. Even the stone gargoyles seemed to grimace, as if they were forced to watch a low-budget fantasy epic unfold before them. Alaric thrust his sword toward the crown's black heart, feeling the metal hum like a disgruntled Wi-Fi router. As the blade met the cursed gem, a pulse of darkness surged outward, knocking him to his knees with a force that smelled oddly of burnt popcorn. He realized then that the only way to end the nightmare was to become the ultimate sacrifice, a dramatic exit worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster finale. With a wry grin, he whispered, "May the force be with my enemies," and he flung himself into the vortex of black energy, his blood mixing with the fire to create a river of ruby light. The palace shuddered, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final credits to roll. When the inferno finally settled, the black crown lay shattered, its shards glittering like broken mirrors on a dirty floor. The dark heart fizzed out with a sigh that smelled faintly of wet wool and old cheese, leaving behind a silence louder than any drum roll. Survivors emerged, coughing up ash and half-eaten pastries, their armor dented but their spirits oddly buoyed by the absurdity of it all. The sorceress's spirit evaporated in a puff of lavender perfume, as if she had just left a particularly stale bathhouse. Alaric's name would be sung by bards for generations, usually accompanied by a wink and the line, "He died so the crown could finally stop bleeding, and so could the kingdom's laundry budget." When the ancient crown finally cracked, splintering with a sound like 1,000 cursed teaspoons clinking against porcelain, the veil of gloom that had draped Eldoria burst like an overripe bubble. Sunlight, long starved, poured in, turning the cobblestones from gray ash to molten amber, while the air filled with the sweet perfume of thawing pine and fresh mown hay. Villagers emerged from their damp cellars, blinking as if they'd just woken from a century-long nap, their feet squelching in the mud that smelled of iron and fermenting beetroot. Even the ravens, those grim-faced heralds of doom, perched lazily on broken battlements, cooing like confused pigeons that had watched too many late-night horror movies. Amid the chaos, the surviving royals gathered around Selene, whose eyes glimmered like polished onyx, and whose counsel cut through the haze like a razor-sharp quill. She spoke of past betrayals and whispered that the curse had fed on secrecy, thriving in the shadows of unspoken sins. The king, once as proud as a peacock in a royal procession, now crouched low, feeling the cool trickle of spring water on his boots and the gritty grit of broken glass beneath his feet. Their council chamber, once adorned with velvet drapes, now smelled of damp stone and the faint tang of spilled wine, a reminder that even the most gilded halls can get a little soggy. Together they pledged to remember the darkness, not as a decorative tapestry, but as a scar that would keep them humble, like a tattoo you can't hide when you splash water on your face. Transparency became their new royal edict, a policy as blunt as a medieval mace, but as refreshing as a cold ale after a long march. They vowed to let the common folk hear the truth, even if it stung like nettles or made them squirm like a dragon in a tiny wardrobe. In a moment of irony, the queen declared that no more royal secrets would be buried, because burying them had already produced enough archaeology for a lifetime of tourists. The courtiers, still wiping mud from their sleeves, laughed nervously, recalling the old legend that the curse would only lift if someone finally confessed. They'd once binge-watched a whole season of Game of Thrones in one sitting, because apparently the gods love a good marathon. Selene raised an eyebrow, quipping that the real tragedy was the kingdom's inability to taste the new strawberries blooming in the fields, which smelled like sugar and rebellion. Even the palace chefs, accustomed to cooking with fear, now sautéed herbs with a flourish, their pans clanging like applause in the great hall. The scent of rosemary and cracked pepper mingled with the distant echo of children shouting, "Freedom!" a chorus louder than any royal proclamation. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of rose and bruised plum, Eldoria stood reborn, its people breathing in the crisp, hopeful air that tasted like tomorrow. The surviving royals, their crowns now modest circlets of woven oak, marched forward with Selene at their side, each step stirring up a faint perfume of wet earth and fresh parchment. They carried the weight of memory like a well-worn satchel, its contents spilling out only when needed, never to be hoarded like a dragon's hoard. And so, with humility stitched into every seam of their new governance, they promised to guard the kingdom not with iron fists, but with open hands, ready to catch both the fallen leaves of the past and the blossoming buds of the future. The mist-cloaked hamlet of Ravenshallow clings to the edge of a dark wood like a stray sock on a laundry line, stubborn and impossible to ignore. Young Alina, known for her deft fingers and sharper tongue, tends to a garden of rosemary, feverfew, and the occasional poisonous nightshade with a grin that could scare a crow. Across the cobblestones, Magistrate Jacob, so stern his eyebrows could be used as a ruler, inspects the town charter while muttering about order and proper conduct. Whispers drift from the tavern about a cursed forest that sighs at midnight, and a newborn that stopped breathing the day after the moon turned blood red. The air crackles, not with magic, but with the uneasy buzz of a village on the brink of hysteria. Alina shuffles through the herb rows, her boots sinking into damp earth that smells of rot and fresh pine, a perfume that would make a perfumer weep. She plucks a sprig of mugwort, watching its silver leaves quiver like tiny flags in a wind that never arrives. Meanwhile, Jacob rides his gaunt horse down the lane, his cloak flapping like a grim banner, eyes scanning every doorway for signs of mischief. He pauses at the well, where the water bubbles with the grayness of old gossip, and mutters a reprimand about idle hands and idle tongues. The two cross paths, exchanging a curt nod that feels like a secret handshake between a witch and a witch hunter. The rumors spread faster than a viral meme on a medieval version of TikTok, if you can imagine a town crier with a smartphone. Old Marta swears she heard the trees chanting in the dead of night, a chorus that would make even the most seasoned monks ask for earplugs. Children clutch their mothers' skirts, eyes wide as if they'd just seen a dragon, while the elders mutter about the cursed forest, like it were a new Netflix series everyone pretends not to watch. A nervous baker jokes that if the forest were truly cursed, perhaps it could finally explain why his sourdough never rises, prompting an awkward silence that smells like burnt crust. Irony hangs in the air, as thick as the smoke from the hearth, and even Jacob's stern face cracks a tiny smile, though he quickly hides it behind a frown. When baby Lysander's tiny chest stopped moving, the entire village went still, the silence louder than the church bells at midnight. The infant's limp body lay swaddled in a blanket that smelled of damp wool and spilled goat milk, a tragic tableau that sent shivers down every spine. Mothers clutched their own babies tighter, whispering prayers that sounded like desperate pleas for a Wi-Fi signal in the afterlife. Jacob, his hands clenched into fists, declared an official inquiry, his voice booming like a thunderclap that could frighten even the forest's whispers. Alina, eyes damp with grief, whispered to the wind that perhaps the forest was not cursed, but merely misunderstood, like a misunderstood villain in a superhero movie. The village square, once filled with the clatter of market stalls, now thrums with nervous murmurs and the occasional muttered accusation. Fear has settled like a heavy coat, its fibers woven from old superstitions, fresh grief, and the ever-present dread of being labeled a witch. Jakob sharpens his gavel, ready to strike down any hint of sorcery, while Alina sharpens her knives, preparing remedies that might heal, or perhaps become the very potions the townsfolk fear. As twilight drapes the cottages in shadow, the cursed forest looms, its canopy rustling like a secret audience waiting for the next act. In this tense hush, the stage is set for a drama where whispers become screams, and the line between healer and hocus pocus blurs faster than a magician's sleight of hand. Father Matthias swaggered onto the cracked stone pulpit, his hair wild as the sermon's fire, and he slammed his fist on the lectern like a hammer on a blacksmith's anvil. The congregation tasted ash in the air, the sour scent of melted tallow mingling with sweat and fear. He cried, "The devil rides a wolf!" And the crowd gasped, as if a wolf had indeed slipped through the nave's ancient door. With every booming word, he painted Alina as a blackened silhouette against a sky of sins, his eyes glinting like polished silver coins. By the time he finished, the pews trembled like a nervous audience at a rock concert. Behind the altar, a secret council of elders slipped into the damp cellar, their cloaks dripping the chill of midnight. They huddled around a candle that sputtered as if it had a cold coffee habit, debating whether Alina's moon-lit herb garden counted as witchcraft or just a desperate farmer's fertilizer. One elder whispered, "If we let her go, the devil might rent a room on the next floor," while another muttered about the village's ancient charms that smelled of rosemary and rot. Their voices rose and fell like a badly tuned bagpipe, each argument a thin rope pulling tighter over the villagers' heads. The council's decision would soon become the village's very own Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, plus a lot more mud. Outside, the villagers gathered like a flock of nervous chickens, clutching amulets shaped like tangled twine, while the scent of wet earth soaked their boots. Old Granny Hilda pressed a dried bat wing into a child's palm, insisting it would ward off evil, while Father Matthias brandished a pamphlet titled Divine Justice. No refunds. The tension crackled louder than a hearth fire that had been left too long without logs, and the townsfolk swayed between the comforting lull of their folk songs and the preacher's cold, iron-clad doctrine. Some whispered that the devil had already booked a seat at the next harvest feast. Others muttered that perhaps the true demon was a tax collector. The choice felt as stark as picking between bitter coffee and sweet tea, except the loser would be burned. Alina, hands trembling like a mouse caught in a trap, stood in the square, her hair a tangled nest of herbs and dread. She inhaled the sour stink of urine and goat manure that clung to the market stalls, feeling every eye as heavy as a piled high stack of hay bales. When Father Matthias pointed his gaunt finger at her, she blinked, remembering the time she'd accidentally brewed a potion that turned a rooster's crow into a squeaky toy, an anecdote the crowd now regarded as a demonic omen. Her voice cracked. "I swore only to heal," yet the crowd's murmurs rose like an angry chorus of cicadas at dusk. The magistrate's gavel slammed with a dull thud, echoing the final note of a church organ that had been out of tune for years. In the end, the village chose the preacher's brand of justice, a decision as inevitable as a Netflix binge when the Wi-Fi is down. Alina was led away, her feet scraping the cobblestones that smelled of spilled ale and rain-soaked straw, while the townsfolk whispered that the devil had finally found a parking spot in the churchyard. Father Matthias smiled, his grin as wide as the Cheshire Cat's, and proclaimed that the night would be clean of witches, until the next harvest, when rumors of a cursed pumpkin would sprout like a tick-tock challenge. The air grew thick with incense, ash, and the faint metallic tang of fear, a perfume no perfume maker could ever bottle. And somewhere, beyond the flickering lanterns, a lone owl hooted as if to say, "Welcome to the real-life Stranger Things, but with fewer demogorgons and more mud." Alina stood in the dank stone chamber, the torchlight flickering like a nervous whisper. The magistrate slammed his gavel, and the echo bounced off the vaulted ceiling as if the walls themselves were gossiping. A cracked mirror lay on the stone slab, shards glittering like broken stars that seemed to stare back at her soul. She felt the chill of unseen eyes, the scent of mildew mixing with the metallic tang of fear. The interrogator's voice cracked like a cracked lute, demanding that she confess to consorting with the beyond. Behind her, a blackened goat hung from a beam, its hooves clattering against iron like a morbid metronome. The animal's fur smelled of ash and old curses, releasing a sour stench that made Alina gag. Spectral evidence swirled around the room, whispered curses that sounded suspiciously like a chorus from a bad horror film, each syllable dripping with accusation. The accused witnesses pointed at the mirror shards, arguing that reflections were portals for witches to spy on the village. Alina's heart hammered, and she could almost hear the goat snort a sarcastic moo at the absurdity of it all. Meanwhile, Jakob paced the outer courtyard, his conscience a storm of rusted armor and soft regret. He watched the rain patter on the cobblestones, each drop sounding like a ticking clock, counting down to another wrongful execution. The villagers' accusations smelled of cheap ale and burnt incense, masking a deeper, greed-laden motive that tickled his mind like a mischievous imp. He recalled a whispered rumor that the accusers coveted the meadow owned by the accused family, a plot as obvious as a hidden cheat code in a video game. Jakob clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his own morality slip like sand through his fingers. When the accusers gathered, their faces wore masks of piety, yet their eyes glittered with the same hunger that drives a cat to swat at a laser pointer. Their motives, thin as parchment, unraveled like a poorly stitched tapestry when Jakob confronted them with a single question. Who really benefits when a woman is condemned? A nervous chuckle escaped the village elder, as if he'd just realized he'd been cast in a medieval version of a reality show. The irony hung heavier than the goat's carcass, because the very fear they invoked was a tool to hide their own sins. Jakob felt a wry smile curl on his lips, knowing that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear holy robes. In the end, the courtroom buzzed with the sighs of the condemned and the shuffling of the guilty, a symphony of dread that would echo through generations. Alina's eyes, though bruised, sparkled with a defiant fire that no mirror could reflect back. The smell of charred goat lingered, a reminder that fear can be as stale as last week's bread, but just as intoxicating. Jakob walked away, his conscience a battered shield, whispering a line from a distant bard about the darkness that lives inside us all. As the doors slammed, a lone crow perched on the window sill, seemingly muttering, "May the force be with you," in perfect medieval irony. The town council's oak doors slammed shut, sealing the day's grim finale. Alina, hands still trembling from the witch hunt interrogations, stood before the iron jail, her eyes a storm of dread. The magistrate, puffing on a pipe that smelled of swampy peat, read the verdict like a bad karaoke lyric: guilty, to be burned. A murmur rippled through the crowd, like the low hum of a badly tuned lute, as townsfolk whispered about broomsticks and curses. Even the baker's apprentice, clutching a stale loaf, could not hide the shiver that crawled up his spine. The execution square smelled of wet wood, rust, and freshly churned fear, a bouquet no Renaissance perfumer would dare bottle. As Alina was led to the stake, a sudden wind tore through the cobbles, rattling the shutters and scattering loose thatch like confetti at a medieval rave. Dark clouds rolled in growling thunder that sounded suspiciously like an angry bear with a megaphone. Rain began to patter, turning the ground into a slippery mess that made every footstep squelch and sigh. The townspeople huddled under their shawls, cheeks flushed from cold, and the creeping realization that the heavens themselves were auditioning for a horror movie. When the fire was lit, the flames behaved like mischievous sprites, licking the wood in colors that no candle ever dared to show: emerald, violet, and a flicker of copper that seemed to whisper secrets. The heat crackled, sending sparks up into the stormy sky, where they danced like fireflies on a caffeine binge. Alina's cloak smoldered, releasing a scent of burnt rosemary and panic, the kind of aroma that makes you wish you'd taken a different career path. A nervous boy in the front row tried to snap a wooden spoon in half, but the spoon snapped back, as if the wood itself were judging his bravery. The crowd winced and chuckled, wondering if the inferno had taken a lesson from a Netflix series that promises endless plot twists. Just as the fire reached its zenith, an apparition slipped through the smoke, a pale figure draped in tattered robes, eyes glinting like polished onyx marbles. It hovered above the stake, its voice a thin wail that sounded like a choir of cats fighting over a single piece of fish. The ghost's hands rose, and the storm seemed to obey, sending a bolt of lightning that illuminated the apparition's face. A gaunt, ancient witch, half melted like cheese on a pizza oven. The townsfolk gasped, some dropping their pitchforks, others clutching their rosary beads tighter than a miser's purse. In that eerie tableau, humor slipped in. One drunk farmer whispered, "Well, that's one way to get a selfie with the afterlife," before the wind stole his words. When the apparition faded, a heavy silence fell, broken only by the hiss of dying embers, and the collective realization that the true terror lay not in Alina's alleged spells, but in the town's own tinderbox of suspicion. The council members shifted uncomfortably, their faces as pale as the moonlit cobblestones, as the crowd began to murmur about accountability like a choir of gossiping sparrows. A brave voice, an old midwife who had survived 3 plagues, stood up, her eyes sharp as a needle, declaring that fear itself had been the fire feeding the flames. The townspeople, suddenly aware of their own hysteria, muttered apologies that tasted like sour cider and regret. With a final crackle, the stake collapsed into ash, leaving behind a lesson as crisp as a fresh-baked loaf. Sometimes the monsters we hunt are the ones we carry in our own pockets. The wind finally gave up, leaving the valley as quiet as a monk's sneeze. Muddy footprints glistened in the waning light, each one a reminder of the night's chaotic ballet of screams and curses. Jakob stood on the hill, breathing the cold, iron-tanged air, feeling the weight of every dead goat and broken charm. The storm's silence felt like a church organ holding a single, trembling note, demanding reflection. Even the crows seemed to gossip about the absurdity of fearing invisible witches. Jakob drafted a petition by candlelight, his ink smearing like the river's silt after the flood. He addressed the crown with a mixture of desperation and dry wit, urging the king to ban the witch hunters who behaved like reality TV judges on a guilty plea show. The parchment smelled of sweat, damp wool, and a hint of fresh rye bread from the bakery down the lane. When he sealed it with wax, a tiny crackle echoed, as if the seal itself were sighing in relief. He mailed the letter on a lark's winged courier, hoping the monarch would read it before another blood-spattered frenzy took root. Father Matthias vanished the morning after the executions, leaving only a rusted key and a half-eaten loaf on the altar. The townsfolk whispered that the devil had finally collected his dues, but the priest's habit was still draped on a chair, smelling of incense and moth-eaten vellum. Some swore they saw his shadow slipping through the chapel's cracked, stained glass, as if he were a glitch in a medieval video game. The silence that followed his disappearance felt thicker than the nighttime fog that used to choke the village. Even the church bells, usually reluctant participants in the chaos, rang a solitary, mournful note that seemed to ask, "Who's really pulling the strings?" The surviving villagers gathered around the smoldering hearth, stirring a pot of stew that reeked of burnt cabbage and burnt hopes. They swapped stories like trading cards, each tale stripping away a layer of the supernatural myth that had once cloaked the murders. An elderly baker, who could smell fear the way others smelled fresh dough, declared that the witches were merely scapegoats for a famine that tasted of stale porridge. Laughter cracked through the room when a teenager quipped that the whole ordeal felt like an episode of Game of Thrones gone terribly wrong, except with fewer dragons and more superstitious peasants. Slowly, the crowd leaned into a skeptical hush, as if listening for the echo of reason amidst the lingering ash. From the cracked stone of the town square, a lone sapling pushed its green shoots through the ruined mortar, a stubborn reminder that mercy can sprout even in charred soil. Jakob received a modest reply from the crown, a decree to curb the witch hunters, inked in a font as stiff as a medieval boot, but softened by a marginal note urging compassion. The villagers, now wary of whispers, began to plant herbs not for spells but for soup, letting the scent of rosemary replace the acrid perfume of fear. Though the shadows of the past lingered like a lingering cough after a cold, a tentative hope settled over the hamlet like the first warm breath after a long winter. In the end, redemption arrived not with trumpets, but with the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional chuckle that said, "We survived, and we're still standing." In the mist-shrouded highlands of medieval Scotland, Castle Ravenshallow looms like a brooding gargoyle perched on craggy stone. Its towers cough smoke and secret, and inside, Lady Elspeth glides through tapestries as if she were a living banner for a marriage arranged by her father's cunning allies. The noblewoman's cheeks are flushed not by love, but by the iron-clad decree that will bind her to a foreign lord she has never met. Meanwhile, beneath the banquet hall, a network of forgotten tunnels snakes like a bad Wi-Fi signal, harboring a low-born minstrel named Aidan who hums off key verses to keep the rats at bay. The castle's very walls seem to lean in, whispering of a story that will soon tangle the noble blood with a stray cord. Aidan's world is a chorus of dripping stone, the sour stench of mildew, and the occasional clatter of a guard's boot on cobbled floor above. He weaves through the labyrinth, his satchel jingling with a lute, a half-eaten oatcake, and a dagger borrowed from a drunk squire, essentially a medieval multi-tool. By the glow of a lone torch, he practices love songs in a voice that would make even the banshee sigh, hoping the echo will reach the lady's chambers without alerting the castle's resident cat, Sir Whiskers, a creature as regal as a miniature lion. The tunnels hum with the low murmur of the castle's heart, a rhythm that matches the quickening beat in Aidan's chest every time he hears Elspeth's laughter drift downhill. Yet every step he takes is a gamble, for the walls have ears, and the stone is as gossip-prone as a village market. One moonless night, Elspeth's curiosity outpaces her propriety. She slips a candle through a cracked window and follows the flickering light into the tunnel's yawning mouth. The air tastes of damp wool and rust, and Aidan greets her with a crooked smile and a lute that squeaks like a cat in a bathtub. Their eyes lock, and the forbidden attraction erupts like a sudden fireworks display, except the fireworks are made of sighs, stolen glances, and the occasional snort of laughter when Aidan jokes that he's better at love than his last employer, a dragon-obsessed warlord. They trade verses, each line dripping with irony. She, a lady of silk, declares she would rather be a kitchen maid, while he promises to write ballads that would make even Shakespeare blush. The castle's stone walls, soaked with centuries of secrets, seem to giggle as they whisper, "Do not tell the mother of all politics that I, the great hall, approve of this scandal." As dawn claws its way over the heather, the distant clang of war drums rattles the valley, announcing that the neighboring clan will soon storm Ravenshallow's gates. Lady Elspeth feels the weight of a crown that never fit her head, while Aidan hears the clatter of swords sharpening, a sound that smells of blood and burnt pine. Family intrigue tightens like a rope around her throat. Her betrothed, Lord Macleod, plots to exchange the castle for a treaty, oblivious to the blossoming love blooming in the dark below. The whispers in the stone grow louder, now laced with dread, as servants mutter about curses and the castle's previous owners who vanished after a similar illicit affair. Think Game of Thrones, but with more moss and less dragons. In the midst of this chaos, the two lovers exchange a promise sealed with a kiss that tastes of cold iron and the sweet tang of fear, knowing that any misstep could turn their romance into a tragic ballad sung by the very walls themselves. The day the siege begins, rain slashes the castle like 1,000 angry shurikens, and the stone corridors echo with the roar of battle and the occasional squeak of Sir Whiskers fleeing his own shadow. Elspeth, cloaked in a battlefield dress, sneaks down to the tunnels, only to find Aidan pinned beneath a fallen beam, his lute cracked like an egg and his eyes still shining with mischievous defiance. With a frantic pull, she lifts the stone, and together they slip through a hidden exit, sprinting into the howling wind as the castle collapses behind them. An ending as dramatic as any Hollywood apocalypse, albeit with fewer explosions and more mud. The whispering walls of Ravenshallow crumble, sending a final sigh that carries their names across the moors, ensuring that every future traveler will hear the tale of a lady and a minstrel who dared to love against destiny. And so, dear listeners, remember, in every ancient stone lies a secret, and sometimes that secret ends with a sigh, a laugh, and a lingering note that refuses to fade. Under the moonlit shroud of the East Tower, Elspeth slipped past rust-spattered iron grates into the forgotten chapel hidden beneath the stone ribs. The chapel reeked of stale incense and damp stone, a perfume that made the air feel like a damp cellar after a rainstorm. Candlelight flickered over faded frescoes, casting trembling shadows that looked oddly like a medieval Snapchat filter. Elspeth's heart hammered like war drums, while Aidan whispered vows as soft as a lover's sigh in a horror movie trailer. Their secret meeting felt both epic and absurd, as if Romeo and Juliet had decided to ghost text each other from the catacombs. In the hushed sanctuary, they exchanged clandestine vows, sealing their love with a kiss that tasted of cheap wine and iron from the tower's old hinges. Their hands brushed over a cracked altar stone, sending a shiver up Aidan's spine like the first drop of a cold bath. Unbeknownst to them, the Lord's steward, an envious man with a twitchy mustache, had uncovered a love letter tucked inside a looted goblet, its ink smelling of sweat and scandal. He read the confession by candlelight, his eyes widening like a gamer spotting a cheat code. The discovery set off a cascade of threats that stank of boiled blood and rotten bread, forcing the lovers to consider fleeing or fighting. The steward, slick as a courtly snake, began sending angry messengers who rattled the castle corridors with clanking armor and the scent of burnt oil. Each messenger left a warning scrawled on the walls. "Love kills, betrayal follows," a note that tasted as bitter as ale left out in the sun. Elspeth and Aidan responded by huddling in the chapel's crypt, where the walls dripped with mossy condensation that felt like the tears of the building itself. Their plan grew wilder, with Aidan joking that they might need a superhero cape, maybe a little Batman, but with more brooding, to escape the steward's grasp. The tension crescendoed, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and the sweet smell of desperation. Desperate, the pair summoned the castle's ancient ghosts, entities that lingered like dusty mannequins in forgotten hallways. A trembling specter of a former lady-in-waiting brushed past Elspeth, leaving a trail of chilled air that smelled of mildew and wilted roses. Another ghost, a grizzled knight with rust-colored armor, clanked around Aidan, rattling chains that sounded like an old vinyl record skipping. The ghosts whispered advice in cracked whispers, their voices echoing like a medieval Wi-Fi hotspot, weak but surprisingly reliable. Together they forged a pact beneath the tower, trading promises for protection, their alliance as improbable as a sitcom crossover between Game of Thrones and Friends. Armed with spectral allies, Elspeth and Aidan plotted a daring escape, slipping through hidden passages that reeked of damp earth and centuries-old filth. The steward's men prowled the corridors, their boots squelching in stale urine, oblivious to the flickering phantom lights guiding the lovers onward. Just as the steward lunged with a sword slick with rust, a ghostly hand brushed his cheek, sending him staggering back with a scream that sounded like a kettle boiling over. The lovers burst into the night, the East Tower's silhouette framing them like a dramatic movie poster, their laughter echoing against the stone. Though their future remained uncertain, the secret pact beneath the tower ensured that love, even when tangled with ghosts and jealous stewards, could still find a way to outshine the darkest of castles. The iron sky over Ravenshallow roared with the thundering drums of the invading army, a sound that rattled even the ancient stone gargoyles perched on the battlements. Inside the great hall, Lord Malcolm, with his cloak fluttering like a disgruntled peacock, ordered the great iron doors slammed shut, condemning his betrothed Elspeth to a cage of silk and sorrow. The scent of damp moss and burning pitch swirled through the corridors, mixing with Elspeth's perfume of lavender and fear. Servants whispered that love in a siege was as foolish as posting a selfie on a battlefield, but Malcolm's eyes glittered with cold ambition. As the siege engines clanged, Elspeth pressed her hand against the cold stone, feeling the pulse of the castle like a dying heart. Across the shattered courtyard, Aidan, the reckless squire with a grin wider than a tavern door, gathered a ragtag band of rebels who cheered for the love of all that is holy and the occasional loot. They slithered up the crumbling battlements, the wind howling like a medieval karaoke singer off-key, while the clang of steel met the squeak of old wooden ladders. Aidan's sword sang a fierce ballad, carving a path through the enemy's armor as if he were auditioning for a Netflix medieval drama. The night smelled of blood, iron, and the oddly comforting aroma of roasted chestnuts from the siege camp's mess hall. With a daring leap, Aidan vaulted over the gate's iron portcullis, shouting, "I'm coming for you, Elspeth. No need for a rescue dog, I'm the real hero." Just as Aidan reached the tower, a thunderous crack split the air. The ancient walls, weathered by centuries of rain and gossip, finally gave way with a roar that echoed like a giant's sneeze. Stones tumbled, dust choked the night, and the castle's spine shuddered, scattering both lovers into separate shadows. Elspeth's silk dress tore, exposing her trembling skin to the cold, while Aidan fell into a moat of slime that smelled like forgotten cheese and mud. The sound of splintering timber mixed with the distant cries of soldiers, creating a chaotic symphony that would make even Beethoven wince. In that instant, the castle's one-swarm heart turned into a bruised, battered bruise, leaving the two lovers grasping at air and regret. As Elspeth clambered through the debris, her trusted handmaiden, Greta, slipped a jeweled dagger into her palm, whispering, "Trust no one, especially those who love you with a price tag." Greta's betrayal tasted of sour wine and betrayal, a bitter cocktail that left Elspeth's tongue tingling like a shocked electric eel. Meanwhile, Lord Malcolm, believing his plan was as solid as the castle's stone foundations, learned that his closest confidant, a pious monk who hid a stash of cheap ale, had sold the secret passage to the enemy for a pint. The irony dripped like candle wax. The man who ordered the lockup was now locked out of his own power, watching from a balcony while his own troops whispered, "Game over, bro." Both Elspeth and Malcolm found themselves haunted by familiar faces turned foes, their love story unraveling like a badly knitted sweater. In the aftermath, Aidan emerged from the silt, covered in muck and triumphant as a kid who found the last cookie, only to discover Elspeth had vanished into the forest, pursued by a wolf pack that sounded suspiciously like a boy band's backup singers. Malcolm, clutching a broken seal of his house, stared at the ruined battlements and realized that power without love is as hollow as a drum used for applause in an empty theater. The castle's ghosts whispered of a love that burned brighter than the siege torches, yet was snuffed out by greed, betrayal, and a lot of unfortunate timing. Ravenshallow's stone now bears scars that glisten in the moonlight, each crack a reminder that even the most fortified hearts can crumble under a misdirected arrow of destiny. And so, the legend of the Siege of Hearts lives on, told by minstrels who chuckle, weep, and occasionally throw a wink to the audience, because even tragic endings deserve a standing ovation. The moon, a shy lantern, slipped through the cracked vaults of the ruined chapel, casting ghostly ribbons across moss-slick stones. In that fleeting night of peace, Elsprie slipped past the crumbling altar, her heart drumming like a war horse in a ballroom. There, under a cracked fresco of a saint with a suspiciously modern haircut, she found Aidan, his sword still clinging to the rust of old battles. Their eyes met, sparking a fire brighter than the candle-lit tavern in a Monty Python sketch. For a heartbeat, the world hushed, as if the castle itself held its breath for a forbidden love story. But the silence shattered when Malcolm, the castle's grim steward, crept in, his armor clanking like a broken metronome. He spotted the couple, his visor reflecting their startled faces and the flicker of torchlight. "No more late-night hookups in my holy ruin," he snarled, as if quoting a medieval Tinder denial. The air grew thick with the scent of damp stone and mildew, a perfume that would make any Victorian romance novelist wince. Irony dripped from Malcolm's words. He'd once swore to protect the chapel's sanctity, yet now he threatened to stain it with blood. A duel ignited as quickly as a Netflix binge, swords flashing like paparazzi bulbs at a celebrity scandal. Steel sang against steel, each strike echoing through nave arches like 100 angry seagulls over a seaside cliff. Elsprie dodged a thrust, her skirts whipping up dust that smelled of ancient incense mixed with the pungent tang of fear. Malcolm's blade found a glint of moonlight, and he laughed, a sound like a cracked gargoyle cough, while Aidan countered with the finesse of a Jedi in a low-budget costume drama. Sparks sprayed, painting the gloom with fleeting fireworks that would make any 4th of July jealous. The climax came when Malcolm's sword slipped, grazing Aidan's side, and crimson erupted, seeping into the chapel's stone like cheap wine into a carpet. Blood slicked the ancient flagstones, turning their gray veins into rivulets of ruby that mirrored the stained glass saints weeping in silence. Aidan staggered, his breath a harsh rasp that tasted of iron and regret, his eyes flickering like a dying TV screen. Elsprie clutched his hand, feeling the warm, sticky puddle seep between their fingers, the smell sharp enough to cut through any perfume of nobility. Even the bats overhead seemed to pause mid-flight, as if the whole castle mourned the loss of a love that could have been a best-selling romance novel. "Mercy!" Elspeth cried, her voice cracking like an old vinyl record, pleading for a reprieve that the stone walls refused to grant. Malcolm, stoic as a statue carved by a bored apprentice, raised his sword again, his shadow stretching across the blood-stained floor like a black and white Netflix intro. The cruel dawn crept in through the shattered windows, its golden light turning the gore into a macabre still life worthy of a Van Gogh night. As Aidan's life ebbed, the chapel seemed to sigh, the wind through the ruined rafters whispering a lullaby that would make even the bards weep. And so the tragic dawn rose, sealing their story in the mortar, a legend of forbidden love that would haunt every tourist's guidebook, like a cursed Easter egg in a video game. On a moonless night, the wind howled through the narrow slit of Ravenshallow's highest parapet, rattling the ancient stones like a drum set in a haunted tavern. Elspeth stood there, her cloak soaked with rain and tears, feeling the chill of grief seep into her very marrow. She clutched a wilted rose. It sent a bruised mix of earth and forgotten perfume, while the distant echo of Aiden's laughter drifted like a ghostly jig. The castle's torches flickered, painting her silhouette in a trembling amber glow that mocked her sorrow. In that moment, the stone seemed to whisper, "Do you really need a dramatic exit?" With a breath that tasted of iron and regret, Elspeth stepped over the edge, the stones below snapping like brittle pretzels under her weight. The wind caught her hair, turning her fall into a desperate pirouette, and the castle walls shivered as if the building itself were sighing. She landed beside Aiden, whose own cold hand lay outstretched, as if waiting for a lover who'd finally finished the final season of their tragic series. Their bodies tangled amidst the dead ivy, the smell of damp stone and stale incense filling the air like a forgotten perfume counter. The castle's ancient gargoyles seemed to raise an eyebrow, noting that love truly does make you do stupid things, like free-falling into eternity. Centuries later, weary travelers huddled by the fire in the inn at Ravenshallow swore they heard a mournful song drifting through the corridors, a melody that hung heavy as a sack of wet wool. The tune rose from the parapet like a sigh, threading through cracked windows and the smell of rotting timber, tugging at heartstrings as stubbornly as a cat on a windowsill. Some claimed it sounded like a medieval choir auditioning for a Netflix drama, while others likened it to a broken vinyl record stuck on a loop of heartbreak. The cold stone seemed to pulse, each note reverberating against the cobblestones like a drumbeat for the dead. Even the rats paused, their tiny paws hanging mid-scurry, as if the music had briefed them on the price of forbidden love. Rumors spread faster than gossip at a royal banquet. The song was dubbed the Raven's Lament, a haunting playlist that even Spotify would reject for being too gloomy. Campers reported the harmonies swirled with the scent of damp moss, rusted armor, and the faint tang of spilled ale, creating a sensory cocktail no medieval alchemist could brew. Occasionally, a lone nightjar would join the chorus, its hoot adding a dissonant wink that felt oddly comedic, like the universe's way of saying, "Hey, even ghosts have a sense of humor." One bold bard tried to accompany the echo on a lute, only to have his strings snap in protest, as if the castle itself demanded a silent tribute. The irony was thick. The very walls that silenced love now broadcast it louder than a medieval influencer's live stream. Today, those who wander the ruins still pause at the parapet, feeling the cold bite of the stone and the phantom chill of Elspeth's tears. They listen for that lingering song, for a reminder that love, when forbidden, can turn even the loftiest towers into tragic stage sets. The echo serves as a cautionary anthem, humming that the price of clandestine romance is often paid in stone and sorrow, not in roses and poetry. Yet, oddly comforting, the refrain also whispers that some stories refuse to fade, persisting like the scent of fresh bread in a bakery long closed. So raise a goblet, dear listeners, and toast to the lovers who turned Ravenshallow into a living, breathing ballad, proof that even in death, a good romance can still get more views than any Netflix binge. The hills of ancient Britain rose like ragged breaths, draped in mist that smelled of damp earth and old rope knots. Young Ira, with ink-stained sleeves and a curiosity sharper than a wolf's fang, rode a gaunt pony at the behest of a Saxon lord who wanted proof that the old ways were nothing but fairy tale fluff. The Lord's messengers whispered that the Celtic druids still whispered to the stones, and he hoped Ira's parchment would capture the gossip before the wind stole it. As they passed a gnarled oak that seemed to hum, the air throbbed with the scent of moss and a faint, metallic tang of rust, perhaps the ghost of a forgotten battle. Ira smirked, thinking, if only my grandma's recipes were this dramatic, I'd finally get a Michelin star. She slipped through thorny brambles until the stone circle emerged, a ring of monoliths that looked like giant, mute sentinels keeping watch over the valley. The stones were warm from the setting sun, their surfaces slick with lichen that smelled like damp cheese left out too long. Around them, fireflies flickered like rogue LEDs, and somewhere nearby a creek chattered, its water tasting of iron and old secrets. Ira crouched, listening as a low chant rose from the trees, a rhythm that could have been a medieval rap battle between the wind and the roots. The chorus made the hair on her arms stand up, as if the forest itself were giving her a high five for showing up. The druidic rite began with a bowl of bitter herbs, their smell sharp enough to make a sailor's sea-sick stomach vomit rainbows. Elder men and women, cloaked in wool that smelled faintly of goat milk, tossed sprigs of hawthorn into the fire, each crackle a punctuation mark in the night's story. They spoke of Samhain, the festival when the veil thins, and how witches, those early nature influencers, once brokered deals with spirits for a cup of sunrise. Ira jotted frantically, noting that the term witchcraft felt less like a scary label and more like a cosmic Wi-Fi password for the unseen. A sudden gust blew out the torches, and someone joked, "Guess the ghosts just needed a power outage like a medieval Game of Thrones plot twist." As the ceremony swirled, the trees themselves seemed to join, leaves rustling in a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a choir of gossiping grandmothers. Ira realized the rituals were woven into the very soil, each seasonal festival a stitch in a tapestry embroidered with blood, honey, and the occasional squirrel carcass. Yes, they offered a squirrel, because nothing says sacred like a squeaky sacrifice. The Saxon lord's scribes would later label these practices witchery, a term that now feels as outdated as a floppy disk. Yet the irony was palpable. They tried to document magic, but magic refused to be neatly filed. A passing raven cawed, "Never trust a bird that watches Netflix," and Ira laughed, her voice echoing off the stones like a medieval meme. The night air grew thick with the scent of peat smoke, making her throat feel like she'd swallowed a pinecone. By dawn, Ira rode back, the mist lifting like a curtain revealing a stage set for a new act. Her manuscript, half-scribbled, half-spilled ink, smelling of gooseberries and the lingering chill of the night. She knew the Lord would read her words with a squint, perhaps mistaking the poetry for superstition. But she also knew the shadows she'd captured would linger in the hills long after the parchment curled. In the centuries that followed, folk would whisper about witches gathering under stone circles, a tale that even Hogwarts' defense against the dark arts professor might cite as historical background. Ira's heart thumped with the rhythm of the old drums, feeling both humbled and triumphant, as if she'd just earned a gold star in a medieval version of Survivor. And so, the shadows of the past kept dancing, inviting anyone brave enough to listen to the ancient beat. Ira trudged through the heather-scented hollows of the West Country, her boots squelching in peat as the fog curled like a gossiping ant around the stone cottages. Lantern light flickered over moss-covered thatch, and distant goat bells clanged like an off-beat drum solo. She paused at a crumbling well, where an elderly woman with hair the color of dried nettles offered her a steaming cup of nettle tea that tasted of earthy revenge. The air was thick with the perfume of wild rosemary, and Ira could swear the wind whispered, "Welcome to the real Hogwarts." The village seemed a patchwork quilt, stitched together by stories no one dared write down. In the hearth-lit cottage, folk healers and wise women stirred cauldrons the size of bathtub tubs, tossing wilted lavender, sharp mugwort, and the occasional beetle for good measure. Their hands moved with the confidence of a bartender, mixing a perfect gin and tonic, each pinch of herb releasing a scent that could make a plague-stricken lord forget his misery. They sang low chants that sounded like a medieval karaoke night, the verses looping about moon phases and the fickle moods of the earth. Ira watched as a young apprentice coaxed a sprig of foxglove into a poultice, the plant's delicate bells glistening like tiny alarm clocks for the soul. The whole scene pulsed with a gritty, earthy vitality that could make even a stone-hearted Norman choke on a drop of thyme. Outside, the clang of Norman iron boots on cobblestones grew louder, as if the kingdom itself had hired a marching band to announce its arrival. The conquerors tightened their grip like a miser's purse, demanding taxes in the form of grain and loyalty oaths whispered over ale. Villagers started eyeing each other with the suspicion of cats watching a laser pointer, wondering whose mother well was really a witch's cauldron. Rumors swirled faster than a whirlwind of hay, suggesting that the herbal remedies were nothing but devilish concoctions meant to poison the faithful. The once friendly gossip now tasted of ash and fear, and even the wind seemed to carry a warning hiss. Enter Aldrich, a charismatic priest whose sermons crackled like a power outage, turned fire show, drawing crowds that hung on his every word as if he were the original influencer. He declared that the hidden arts were the devil's own Wi-Fi hotspot, offering free access to temptation and curses. With a wink he quoted St. Augustine, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and apparently rosemary sprigs." The crowd roared, some laughing nervously, others clutching rosaries tighter than a gamer clutching a controller during a boss fight. Aldrich's voice rose, echoing off the stone walls, turning the quiet village into a stage for a drama that would make Shakespeare blush. Fear, once a shy neighbor, swaggered into the tavern, spilling ale on old wooden tables and sloshing into the hearts of men and women alike. Neighbors began accusing each other of secret pacts with demons, pointing at the faintest bruises as proof of cursed sorcery. The once tight-knit community unraveled like a badly sewn quilt, each thread snapping with a hiss of irony. The very women who healed the sick now faced the wrath of those they saved. Ira watched in painful awe as the village turned into a living horror movie set, where whispered curses replaced whispered prayers. In the end, the darkness was not just in the woods, but in the eyes of every villager who turned against his own shadow. The year was 1583, and the mist over the lowlands smelled of rot and wild thyme, as a sudden scourge turned the harvest fields into graveyards. Villagers whispered that the pestilence was the work of Morwen, the enigmatic witch queen who once led a coven of moonlit healers. Her name rode the wind like a curse, half sublime and half silly, as if the gods had given her a Twitter handle, at Hex Queen Morwen. Fear fermented into rage when the village midwife, a stoic woman named Brigid, fell ill and died within a day of a strange, oily rash erupting on her skin. By the time the roosters crowed on the third night, the whole shire felt the burn of a tide coming not from sea, but from suspicion. King Edward, ever the drama-loving monarch, signed a crimson-edged edict that declared witchcraft a treasonous act, punishable by fire and public shaming. The royal messengers thundered into towns on horseback, their boots clattering like a drum roll for a gruesome show, and the proclamation was read aloud in market squares, echoing off stone walls and hungry stomachs alike. Local magistrates, who had previously reserved their fury for petty theft, now brandished iron gauntlets as if they were the latest Marvel superhero gadgets. In taverns, ale-soaked patrons swapped stories of witches riding on storm clouds, while the priest at the corner sneered, muttering that the devil had finally decided to take a vacation in Britain. The edict turned legal parchment into a weapon, and the law itself seemed to smolder with the promise of a fiery finale. Ira, a young scribe with ink-stained fingers, watched the hysteria unfold from the shadow of the courthouse, where the scent of smoldering thatch mingled with the coppery tang of blood. Accused women were thrust onto makeshift platforms, their faces pale as parchment, while the crowd shouted prayers and curses in a chorus louder than a stadium chant. When the flame ignited, it licked the night sky, throwing grotesque silhouettes of twisted limbs against the moon, a macabre fireworks display that would put any modern blockbuster to shame. The crackle of wood burning drowned out the wails of mothers, and the acrid smoke settled in the throats of onlookers, leaving a bitter taste like regret on every tongue. Even the town's baker, normally cheerful, was seen scooping ash into his dough, muttering that the world had gone as sour as overproofed cider. The once tight community began to unravel like an old tapestry, each thread pulled by fear and jealousy. Neighbors who had shared milk and gossip now eyed each other with the suspicion of a reality TV jury, wondering who might be the next hidden sorceress. Ironically, the very women who had tended herbs to cure fevers now found themselves accused of conjuring the very plagues that killed them. A plot twist even the most cynical playwright would applaud. Children hid behind doors, their small hands clutching at blankets as the adult world erupted in flames, while the distant toll of the church bells sounded like a funeral march for common sense. In the end, the burning tide washed away not only the accused, but also the remnants of solidarity, leaving behind a shoreline littered with ash and broken trust. When the last torch sputtered out, the air hung heavy with the smell of charred timber and unanswered questions, as if the world had been scrubbed clean of nuance. Morwen's legend survived, whispered in hushed tones like a bedtime story that refuses to end, reminding folk that the line between healer and witch is as thin as a candlewick. The king, satisfied with his fiery spectacle, likely thought of his own coronation, a sparkle of gold and fireworks, and missed the fact that his subjects' hearts had been set ablaze in a very different way. Ira closed her journal with a sigh, the quill clacking against the wood like a final applause, and wondered whether history would remember the flames or the shadows they cast. In the end, the burning tide was not just a wave of fire, but a surge of hysteria that swept through the British Isles, forever changing how people whispered about power, fear, and a witch queen who might have just been a very unlucky scapegoat. The streets of London throbbed with a feverish clang of bells and the acrid stink of torches, as rumors of witches swirled like smoke over the Thames. In the cramped backroom of an alehouse, Ira, her hair wild as a storm-tossed flag, stood toe-to-toe with Aldrich, the iron-fisted inquisitor whose very name had once been a rallying cry for the hunts. He wore his black robe like a bad superhero cape, the hem whispering against the rough wooden floor, his eyes flickering between wrath and a dawning uncertainty. Around them, patrons muttered prayers and curses, the clatter of mugs punctuating the tension, while the distant clang of the tower's bells seemed to count down to something inevitable. Aldrich's jaw tightened. The once steady voice that condemned covens now trembled like a lute on a windy stage. He confessed, in a hushed rush, that the ink on his own edicts had been smeared with the blood of ambition, not the devil's. From the shadows slipped a motley circle, scholars with spectacles perched on noses like tiny crowns, former witches whose fingertips still glimmered with faint ash, bearing ancient vellum bound in leather that smelled of mildew and candle wax. They laid the cracked manuscripts on the table, each page crackling like old parchment, gossiping secrets long buried beneath the crown's marble floors. The pages unfurled a tale of power-hungry dukes and shrewd parliamentarians who used witchcraft as a convenient scapegoat, a political poison to dissolve rivals. One illuminated illustration showed a nobleman tossing a cursed talisman into a well, the splash echoing like a royal snub. Another entry described a secret council swapping land deeds for whispered accusations, their ink as dark as midnight ale. The circle read aloud, their voices weaving through the dank air, while the scent of spilled ink mingled with the coppery tang of fear that still clung to the room. Ira felt a surge of bitter irony. Her ancestors had once whispered herbs for healing. Now the very notion of sorcery was being weaponized by the very throne that prayed to St. George. With the manuscripts clutched like combustible evidence, the group marched to the Grand Hall of Westminster, its vaulted ceiling echoing with centuries of whispered oaths and the occasional squeak of rats in the stone. Sunlight slanted through stained glass, painting the marble floor in bruised purples and gold, while the crowd, clergy in lace collars, merchants with coin-stained fingers, and a few trembling maidens, buzzed like a beehive on caffeine. Aldrich stepped forward, his robe now a flag of surrender, and thrust the scrolls toward the high priest, his voice cracking like a cracked phone screen in a tick-tock video. The air grew thick with the smell of hot iron from the nearby forge and the sour perfume of nervous sweat, as the parchment fluttered like a nervous pigeon. The high priest, a man whose eyebrows could have hosted a small parliament, read the revelations aloud. His tone rose and fell like a dramatic Netflix trailer, each accusation landing with a thud that rattled the pews. The crowd gasped, some clutching rosaries, others coughing up the dust of centuries of superstition, while a few sly grins slipped through, like a secret meme in a medieval chatroom. As the truth cut through the haze, Aldrich dropped his ceremonial sword, which clanged against the stone floor with a sound as disappointing as a soggy crumpet. In that moment, the veil lifted, exposing the raw, gritty machinery of power, and the hall erupted in a cacophony of cheers, shouts, and the occasional muttered curse. Proof that sometimes the most magical thing is simply a well-timed piece of honesty. When the last of the dreaded witch hunters melted into ash-gray myth, Ira slipped back up the craggy spine of the Welsh hills, the wind snapping like a gossiping ant. The hills smelled of damp moss and old peat, a perfume that whispered of midnight rites and forgotten curses. She carried a leather satchel stuffed with notebooks, each page hungry for the stories the elder women whispered over peat-smoked tea. The sun draped the stone circles in a golden haze, turning standing stones into silent sentinels of the old ways. With a grin that tasted of rebellion, she muttered, "Time to make the past Instagram-worthy for the future," and set out to capture the echoing voices of the hidden. In the hollow of a ruined cairn, a wizened crone named Bridget offered Ira a cuppa brewed from nettles, while the fire crackled like a nervous audience. Bridget's tongue spun legends of moonlit covens that once swapped herbs for secrets, each tale dripping with the scent of bracken and blood, sweet iron. Ira scribbled furiously, noting how the once dangerous charms had softened into lullabies about mischievous pixies and clever foxes. The occult practices, she realized, had slipped into folklore, their sharp edges dulled by generations of storytellers who turned curses into cautionary verses. By the time the moon rose, the hilltop hummed with a chorus of whispers that sounded oddly like a medieval Spotify playlist. Word of these hilltop tales traveled faster than a raven on a caffeine binge, finding its way into the ink-stained desks of romantic poets who adored melancholy and mist. Shelley and Wordsworth, unknowingly sipping the same tea as Bridget, wove the old rites into verses that glorified lonely moors and haunted forests, turning fear into feverish romance. Later, Victorian novelists tucked witchcraft into dusty attic scenes, letting readers glimpse a world where broomsticks weren't just cleaning tools, but metaphorical escape pods. Even modern pop culture got a taste. Think of a teenage wizard in a scarred scarlet sweater, battling dark forces with a wand that probably once belonged to a Highland hag. The transformation was as smooth as a well-aged ale, yet each sip left a faint tang of the original, pungent magic. Ira tucked her painstaking manuscript into a hollow oak, sealing it with wax that smelled of pine and old secrets, then vanished like a phantom at dawn. Centuries later, Dr. Rowan Finch, a lanky academic with a habit of losing his spectacles, tripped over the same oak while chasing a particularly stubborn hare. He brushed away centuries of lichen to reveal the leather-bound treasure, its pages fluttering like startled moths. As he read aloud, the forest seemed to lean in, the wind echoing his astonished chuckle. "Well, that's one way to beat the peer review process." The discovery sent ripples through the university corridors, proving that the past still loved to play hide and seek with the present. Now, in lecture halls filled with the sterile scent of coffee and cheap toner, Dr. Finch shares Ira's verses, his voice rising over the hum of projectors like a shaman over a campfire. Students gasp at the gritty details, blood-soaked herbs, the bitter tang of wormhood, the raw, earthy fear that once pulsed through every clandestine rite. Yet they also smile, recognizing a familiar thread, the human urge to hide, to whisper, to turn darkness into story. The hidden corners of British cultural memory, smudged with ash and illuminated by candlelight, still pulse with that same mischievous energy. As the lecture ends, a lone candle flickers, reminding everyone that witchcraft isn't dead. It's merely waiting in the attic, ready to jump out when you least expect it. The valley of Arlen lay wrapped in a quilt of low, choking mist, the kind that makes you feel like you're walking through a soggy soup. Veteran Scout Mara stepped off the creaking mule, her boots squelching in the damp grass as if the earth itself were trying to swallow her. Beside her, curious chronicler Tomas adjusted his ink-stained notebook, inhaling the sour tang of moss and rot that clung to the air. The two had heard the tale of Grey Hollow for years, but nothing prepared them for the eerie hush that settled like a blanket over the hills. Their shadows stretched long, flickering against the pale rock like nervous puppets awaiting a cue. Gray Hollow had earned its reputation the night the brass cannons roared, and the sky turned blood red, a battle that left a scar the size of a football field. Locals whispered that the fallen soldiers rose each night, their gaunt faces illuminated by the ghostly glow of phosphorescent fungi that sprouted from their boots. The sound of clanking armor echoed through the hollow long after the last cannon fell silent, a metallic chorus that made even the bravest cower. Tomas scribbled furiously, noting the way the wind carried a faint, metallic scent, like rusted pennies dropped in a bathtub. Mara, meanwhile, tightened her grip on her spear, half expecting a spectral foot soldier to tap her shoulder for a friendly handshake. At the edge of the village, a hunched elder named Corin greeted them with eyes that seemed to have seen every war ever fought. He warned them in a voice that rasped like dry leaves. The Legion of the Restless Guard, a relic cursed to choke the very breath of the living. He gestured toward a stone altar half buried under a mound of wilted wheat, where a dull, pulsing stone throbbed like a heartbeat gone bad. The elder's tales were peppered with irony. He claimed the dead were better at keeping the village quiet than the living, a joke that made Tomas chuckle despite the sour stench of decay. Yet his warning rang clear: disturb the relic, and the whole valley would scream louder than a metal concert in a library. Undeterred, Mara and Tomas slipped into the hollow just as the moon rose, casting skeletal shadows that danced like jittery tick-tock stars. The ground squelched underfoot, releasing a bouquet of swampy algae and rust that clung to their throats, while distant clanks sounded like a marching band of busted toys. Suddenly, a hollow-eyed phantom emerged, its armor dented and its visor cracked, and it let out a groan that could have been a medieval version of a Wi-Fi error tone. Tomas tried to keep his composure, noting the irony that ghosts were apparently terrible at hiding. Every rusted helmet reflected the moonlight like a disco ball at a funeral. Mara, with a grin as sharp as her blade, whispered, "If they wanted a drama, they certainly got one," and lunged toward the throbbing stone. The moment Mara's spear brushed the cursed relic, a wave of cold surged through the valley, turning the mist into a thick, frothy stew of sorrow and static. The restless legion froze, their eyes widening as if they'd just seen the final season of Game of Thrones spoilers. Confused, angry, and a little bit lost. A low moan rose from the stone, then cracked open like a soda can shaken too hard, releasing a cloud of ash that smelled of burnt incense and burnt toast. Tomas scribbled his final note, half laughing, half shivering. Never trust a relic that promises eternal peace but delivers eternal sneeze. As the mist began to lift, Mara and the village elder exchanged a look that said, "We survived, but the story's just getting started," and the valley echoed with the distant, mocking whisper of a phantom marching band. Mara and Tomas slumped their battered tarp under the ghost-gray sky, the cold earth sighing beneath their boots as they pitched a flickering lantern. A low, distant drumming rose from the ruined trench, like a heartbeat gone stale, and the moon threw a thin silver blade across the field. Silhouettes of rusted armor flickered in the light, their gauntlets catching glints that reminded Mara of a cursed catwalk. The smell of damp dung and ancient rust gnawed at their throats, a perfume no perfume shop would dare bottle. Still, they laughed nervously. thinking the battlefield might be haunted by the ghosts of over-caffeinated medieval drummers. With shovels in hand, the duo began to dig where the drum beats seemed thickest, each scoop flinging cold muck like confetti at a grim wedding. The soil gave way to a shallow hollow lined with broken lances and a tattered banner that read, "Victory," or from the hollow rose phantom soldiers, armor clanking as if someone had dialed up a medieval version of a haunted house soundtrack. Their faces were a blur of soot and sorrow, eyes glowing like cracked amber, and they charged in a silent replay of their last, doomed assault. Tomas almost slipped on a slab of bone, shouting, "Whoa, talk about a gritty reenactment." The ghostly legion halted inches from the living, forming a spectral line that shouted riddles louder than any battle cry. "What walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 at noon, and never leaves a footprint?" droned a spectral captain, his voice echoing like a malfunctioning GPS. Myra rolled her eyes, muttering, "Great, a sphinx auditioning for a haunted army gig." The riddles twisted through the night air, each one a cryptic lock on the relic they coveted. Yet the phantoms held a mischievous grin, as if they'd just invited the pair to a cosmic game of Jeopardy with the dead. Sweat mixed with the stench of decaying parchment as the pair whispered answers, the first riddle yielding to man and the second to time. The spectral soldiers shivered, their armor rattling like a haunted IKEA flat pack, and a hidden compartment in the earth creaked open. Inside lay a tarnished chalice etched with runes that pulsed like a low-budget sci-fi power core. The ghosts warned, "Only the worthy may drink, lest the battlefield swallow you whole." Tomas, ever the pragmatist, quipped, "I hope it's not like that cursed coffee in the office. No one wants a caffeine-induced apocalypse." Mara lifted the chalice, feeling a cold fire lurch up her arm, as the phantom legion dissolved into a mist of sighs and stale ale foam. The drumbeat faded, replaced by the gentle chirp of crickets that had somehow survived centuries of cannon smoke. They slurped the relic's dark liquid, tasting iron, regret, and a whisper of victory that tasted oddly like caramel popcorn. The battlefield's shadows receded, leaving only the faint outline of helmets on the horizon, like a Netflix, coming soon teaser for history. With the relic secured, they stumbled back to camp, laughing at the irony that the most haunted part of the night was trying to find a decent Wi-Fi signal for their post-adventure vlog. The moon hung like a tarnished coin over the ridge, and the dead army flickered into being, their armor clanking with the rust of centuries. A cold wind carried the scent of damp earth and old blood, making the living feel like they had walked into a medieval morgue. Spectral banners fluttered, embroidered with sigils that glowed like neon cheat codes in a retro video game. The living intruders froze, their hearts drumming louder than the phantom drums of the siege. Somewhere in the distance, a banshee's wail sounded suspiciously like a broken karaoke track. Mara barked orders as if she were a drill sergeant in a war movie, her voice cutting through the night fog like a butter knife through stale bread. The remaining defenders, 3 blacksmiths, a half-drunk tavern keeper, and a goat that hadn't realized it was in a battle, scrambled to form a ragtag shield wall. She joked that at least the ghosts wouldn't charge the goat, but the apparition sneered, proving that even specters have a dark sense of humor. Mud splattered their boots, mixing with the metallic tang of ghostly iron, while the goat bleated a defiant Mula Lisa that seemed to mock the whole scene. Still, Myra's eyes sparkled with stubborn fire. refusing to let the night swallow the village whole. Tomas hunched over an ancient stone altar, his fingers tracing runes that looked like a cursed Instagram caption. He sang the first line of the hymn, a melody that sounded like a lullaby sung by a choir of exhausted pizza delivery drivers. As the note rose, a pale figure materialized, a forlorn knight with a broken visor, clutching a rusted sword that smelled faintly of burnt toast. Each subsequent verse summoned another spirit, a grieving mother dragging a sack of onions, a mischievous pixie that giggled like a malfunctioning Alexa. The deeper the chant, the more vengeful the apparitions grew, their anger crackling like static on a cheap TV set. The battlefield turned into a chaotic mash-up of clashing steel, wailing chants, and the occasional pop culture shout. "Who you gonna call?" echoed from a terrified teenager hiding behind a haystack. Ghostly arrows sliced through the air, leaving trails of luminous dust that smelled like ozone and old laundry detergent. Mara's makeshift shield squeaked under the weight of phantom blows, while Tomas struggled to keep his voice steady, his throat feeling like it was full of gravel and expired soda. The ground beneath them turned slick with ectoplasmic slime, making every step feel like walking through a vat of melted cheese. Yet, every time a new specter appeared, the villagers huddled tighter, their laughter rising in defiant, nervous bursts. With the final verse trembling on his lips, Tomas let the last note spill into the night, a chord so pure it seemed to make the stars hiccup. The spectral army halted, their blades melting into vapor that smelled oddly like fresh coffee on a rainy morning. Mara raised her sword, its blade catching the ghost light and flashing like a disco ball at a 1970s dance club. For a heartbeat, the siege felt like a bad dream that was ending, and the villagers cheered, their voices hoarse and triumphant. Though the night still held shadows, the village had bought itself a few more sunrise minutes, and the ghosts, perhaps embarrassed, retreated to rehearse a softer lullaby for the next midnight. The midnight hour draped the battlefield in a black velvet, broken only by the sudden scream of earth as fissures yawned wide. From the jagged crevices rose a shattered obsidian standard, its shards catching the starlight like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The relic pulsed, humming a low, angry note that seemed to coax the dead legions from their eternal nap. Even the owls above squawked in dismay, as if they'd been hired for a horror soundtrack. The air smelled of rusted iron and old gossip, a fragrance only a cursed war can wear. Mara stepped forward, her boots crunching on the bone dust, and faced the ghostly commander who hovered like a hologram from a broken VR game. "I promise you remembrance," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that could freeze a dragon's breath. The specter raised a translucent sword, its blade clinking like cheap kitchenware, and in a flash of irony, offered her a salute that felt more like a sarcastic thumbs up. Around them, the dead soldiers whispered insults that sounded oddly like an old sitcom's laugh track. The promise hung in the night, heavy as 1,000 unmailed letters. Tomas, ever the choir boy in a battlefield of horror, lifted his throat and began chanting the ancient hymn, each word a blade that sliced through the gloom. His voice spiraled upward, forming a vortex that twisted the very sky into a whirling pancake of clouds and ash. The vortex threatened to gulp both worlds, like a cosmic vacuum cleaner set to max power. Sparks crackled, smells of ozone and burnt parchment mingled, and a stray rat scurried past, apparently unimpressed by the apocalypse. Somewhere in the swirl, a distant war horn sounded, wailing like a forgotten theme song from a 90s video game. The Legion's fury surged, the obsidian shards glinting with a wicked grin, as if they just watched a particularly bad sequel to Game of Thrones. Ghost soldiers surged forward, their armor clanking like an over-enthusiastic percussion section in a rock band, yet their faces were as blank as a meme template. Mara's promise echoed, a beacon that made the dead pause, stare, and perhaps reconsider their eternal overtime. A gust of wind carried the scent of wet dog and stale ale, reminding everyone that even in death, soldiers love a good tavern tale. Irony dripped from the scene as the living, and the dead argued over who had the better Halloween costume. With a final, resonant note, Tomas's hymn slammed into the vortex, snapping it shut like the lid on a stubborn jar of pickles. The obsidian standard shattered completely, rain of black glass clattering onto the ground with a sound like shattered glass plates at a fancy dinner. The ghost commander bowed, emotion both solemn and oddly theatrical, before dissolving into a sigh that rustled the nearby weeds. Mara whispered a quiet farewell, her promise now a living memory etched in the stones, while the battlefield sighed, exhaling centuries of dust and drama. In the quiet that followed, even the night seemed to chuckle, as if the universe had just finished a particularly twisted episode of The Twilight Zone. As the first pale pink rays slipped over the scarred hills, the vortex that had snarled like a mad scientist's lab experiment finally gave way. The whirling maw collapsed with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a tired dragon exhaling after a night of binge-watching. Spectral legionnaires, once as bright as polished armor, now as faint as a Wi-Fi signal in a basement, drifted away, their ghostly banners snapping like old laundry on a windless day. The ancient relic at the heart of the maelstrom cracked open, spilling a gentle amber glow that smelled faintly of fresh bread and old battle smoke. The plains, which had rotted with the stench of rusted metal and spilled blood, breathed a new, crisp air that whispered. Finally, someone turned off the haunted HVAC. Mara trotted back to the thatched roofs, her boots still caked in the gritty mud that tasted like iron toothpaste. Tomas shuffled behind, lugging a sack of herbs that smelled like a forest after a rainstorm and a hint of overcooked stew. Villagers emerged from their doorways, blinking in the dawn light as if they'd just been woken from a Netflix binge and couldn't decide whether to cheer or demand a refund. They greeted the duo with the kind of relief normally reserved for finding a lost sock inside a dryer. Half joy, half bewildered disbelief. The wind carried a chorus of crickets, yet the usual war drums were conspicuously absent, making the silence feel as oddly comforting as a quiet Sunday morning after a houseguest's never-ending karaoke session. Around a crackling fire, Mara spun the tale of the compassionate relic, likening its sigh to a grandma's lullaby that finally puts mischievous sprites to sleep. She spoke of how the vortex's collapse was less a violent ending and more a cosmic apology, like the universe finally admitting it misread the script. Tomas added a wink, noting that even the ghosts seemed to have taken a coffee break, their ethereal chains clinking like iced mugs on a table. The villagers listened, eyes wide as saucers, and soon the legend blossomed into a promise. The battlefield would rest, its scars healing like a scarred superhero finally finding a therapist. A chuckle rippled through the crowd when old Marta muttered, If the ghosts can quit, maybe the tax collector will too. With ink made from soot and the blood of beetles. Because beetle ink is the real thing, you know. Tomas recorded the saga on parchment that crackled like old vinyl. He scribbled the date, the names, and a footnote about the spectral legion's fashion sense. Apparently, ghostly capes are always in season. The scroll would travel to the great library, where future generations might read it while sipping tea and wonder why the dead cared so much about a good night's sleep. Mara laughed, comparing their new legend to the Lord of the Rings sequel nobody asked for, but everyone secretly needed. The villagers promised to protect the story as fiercely as a mother bear guards her cubs, ensuring the battlefield's peace would never be a footnote in a dusty history book. When the sun finally rose high enough to melt the last frost, the plains lay quiet, as if the world had pressed the mute button on a centuries-long war. A gentle breeze rustled the wheat, carrying the faint echo of the relic's sigh, now a lullaby for the land. Mara and Tomas stood side by side, feeling the weight of the day's peace settle like a warm blanket over their shoulders. They exchanged a grin that said, "We survived another episode of haunted history, and we didn't even need a cheat code." And so, as the chapter of Peace at Dawn closed, the haunted battlefield finally earned its long-overdue retirement, ready to host picnics instead of phantoms. The sky over Prague was the kind of gray that makes you wonder whether the city had misplaced its sunlight. Eliska, a lanky archivist with more ink on her fingertips than blood in her veins, trudged up the winding path to St. Bartholomew Cemetery. Fog slithered between the crooked oaks like a nervous cat, soaking her coat in a chilly, damp embrace. She could hear the distant clatter of tram rails and the faint, mournful hymn of a church organ, both trying desperately to break through the silence. When the ancient stone gate emerged from the mist, it seemed to pulse with an old, stubborn heartbeat. The gate, carved with twisted vines and faces that looked like they'd lost a few teeth, whispered names that no living tongue remembered. Each syllable floated out on the wind like a tired sigh brushing Eliska's ear, with the smell of mildew and forgotten candles. She pressed her palm against the cold basalt and felt a tremor, as if the stone itself were humming a medieval ringtone. A pigeon, looking thoroughly unimpressed, cooed from a nearby gravestone, as if to say, "Another tourist with a notebook." The murmurs grew louder, spelling out, "Bretislav, Livia, Jarrow." And then a jarring, modern-day YOLO that made her grin despite the gloom. From the shadows stepped a gaunt figure, his coat dripping with the scent of wet wool and a hint of rosemary incense. Wojtek, the cemetery's caretaker, looked like the kind of man who'd win a costume contest at a Halloween party without even trying. His eyes were dark, deep wells that seemed to have cataloged every epitaph in the city, and his voice cracked like an old vinyl record when he spoke. "Welcome, young archivist," he rasped, wiping a finger across the gate's moss. "You've arrived just in time for the night shift." He tipped an invisible hat, and the wind swirled his shabby scarf, making it look like a poorly animated anime villain's cape. Wojtek warned Eliska that the cemetery's residents were not the quiet, polite types you find on History Channel documentaries. He whispered that restless spirits roamed the grounds, nursing grudges longer than the Empire's tax records. The air grew thicker, tasting of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of ancient armor, as if a forgotten knight had just sneezed. A skeletal hand poked out from beneath a wilted rose bush, tapping a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like the opening beat of Bad Guy by Billie Eilish. Vodtek chuckled. They'll give you a tour if you bring them a decent cup of coffee, preferably not the instant kind. Eliska swallowed the mix of fear and curiosity, noting every odd detail for her ledger, even the way the fog smelled like old cheese left out after a funeral. She lifted her notebook, the pages fluttering like the wings of a moth that just been introduced to a rave. "I'm ready," she declared, trying to sound brave while her knees threatening a mutinous wobble. A chorus of distant whispers answered, chanting in a language older than Czech, yet somehow familiar, like the theme song of a 1990s cartoon played backward. The gate swung shut behind her with a sigh that could have been a sigh of relief, or a dramatic plot twist in a Netflix series, and the night began to breathe. Eliska slipped through the iron-grated archway of the cemetery, her boots crushing centuries-old moss like a crunchy snack. The air smelled of damp stone and a faint, almost sweet, perfume of wilted lilies that clung to the night like an unwanted perfume. Lantern light flickered on the marble crypts, throwing ghostly patterns that danced like a bad Instagram filter. She muttered a joke about haunted house hunting, while a lone crow heckled her from a nearby tomb, its caw echoing like a medieval rap battle. Behind a cracked altar, Eliska uncovered a concealed chapel buried beneath rows of solemn sarcophagi, its walls adorned with sigils that looked like medieval emojis for death and power. In the center, a cursed ledger rested on a pew, its pages whispering curses louder than a toddler's tantrum in a library. She ran her fingers over the ink, feeling it slick as spilled blood, and the letters rearranged themselves into a warning that sounded like an ancient spoiler alert. The chapel's cracked, stained glass shattered silently, raining shards that glittered like broken Pokémon cards on the stone floor. As the last line of the ledger glowed, shadowy silhouettes slithered out from the corners, moving with the grace of bureaucratic paperwork dragging itself across a desk. Their forms were tall, gaunt, and wore the tattered cloaks of forgotten monks, each step muffled by centuries of dust. Eliska's heart hammered like a drumline in a horror movie, and she could almost taste the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. The silhouettes circled, their whispers forming a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a badly dubbed foreign film, promising doom if she stayed too long. Vodtek emerged from the gloom, his beard bristling with the same dust that coated the tombstones, and announced with a grin, "Every guardian is married to a tomb. No divorces allowed." He explained that each specter was bound to a specific crypt, forced to guard a secret so dark it could make a Tolkien villain blush. The guardian near the chapel, a skeletal figure with eyes like cracked amber, clutched a rusted key that smelled of mildew and regret. Vodtek's dry humor about eternal after-hours shifts made Eliska chuckle despite the chill that clawed at her spine. The revelation hit Eliska like a plot twist in a superhero movie. If the secret were unleashed, the world would drown in a tide of midnight, and even the most optimistic Instagram influencer would run out of hashtags. She tucked the cursed ledger into her satchel, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against her ribs like an overenthusiastic hug. With Vodtek at her side, she sprinted toward the main gate, the shadows snapping after her like paparazzi after a celebrity. The cemetery's marble statues stared on, their stone eyes glinting with sarcastic amusement, as Eliska vowed to keep the darkness sealed, or at least give it a proper Netflix spoiler warning. A sudden clang cracked the night as the ancient iron bell, rusted like a dragon's tooth, let loose its mournful toll. Its sound rolled over the northern catacomb, rattling skeletal arches and waking the slumbering guardian known as Sir Aldrich. Sir Aldrich, a knight in rusted armor, rose from his stone slab with the faint smell of damp earth and old incense clinging to his bones. His visor scraped the stone, and a cold wind whispered through the vaulted hallway, as if the very walls were sighing. The bell's reverberation felt like a giant metronome set to doom, and the night's fog turned silver with each echo. Sir Aldrich's mournful wail cut through the catacomb like a ghostly opera, summoning spectral sentinels from crypts that hadn't seen a living foot in centuries. From shadowed niches emerged armor-clad apparitions, their gaunt faces lit by phosphorescent lichens that glowed like cheap Halloween decorations. The air thickened with the scent of mildew and iron, a pungent perfume that made even the bravest bats cough. Their swords, ethereal as moonlight, clinked together, creating a choir of clattering that could rival a heavy metal concert in a library. Yet each phantom moved with the solemn grace of a funeral march, as if rehearsing for a medieval remake of The Matrix. Eliska, clutching a lantern flickering like a nervous tick, Toker's selfie light, slipped deeper into the labyrinth of tombs. The corridors twisted like a pretzel, each turn unveiling frescoes of saints whose eyes seemed to follow her with judgmental disdain. She whispered a half-hearted joke about GPS, only to hear the echo answer back, "Recalculating, you're dead." The floor was slick with centuries of dust and the occasional ooze of ancient funerary wine, making each step a test of balance and bravado. With every breath, she tasted copper and fear, yet pressed on, because abandoning the catacomb would be the ultimate plot twist. Meanwhile, Wojtek stood at the catacomb's heart, his hands trembling like a shaky Wi-Fi signal. He felt his humanity slipping, a slow melt of empathy into a cold, stone-like resolve demanded by the Guardian's oath. The spectral sentinels formed a circle around him, their hollow eyes probing his soul as if asking, "Do you still have a pulse, or have you upgraded to a firmware update?" With a guttural growl that sounded like the distant rumble of an overcooked stew, Wojtek clenched his fists, fighting the urge to become another rattling bone. He chanted the ancient vow, his voice echoing off the walls, a desperate attempt to keep the Guardians from breaking their oath and turning the catacomb into a free-for-all zombie rave. The iron bell's lament reached a fever pitch, and Sir Aldrich, now fully awakened, led his spectral legion in a dance of steel and sorrow. Eliska darted between pillars, her lantern now a comet of orange, while Wojtek's resolve solidified into a blade of pure will. The clash of ghostly swords rang out like a rock concert in a crypt, the sound reverberating through the stone and into the night's chilly lungs. As the final toll faded, the Guardians bowed, honoring their oath, and the catacomb sighed, releasing a puff of stale incense that smelled vaguely of Grandma's attic. With a wry grin, Wojtek muttered, "Well, that was more drama than a Netflix binge." And the trio emerged, the iron bell now silent, its story etched into the very dust beneath their boots. When the blood-red moon slipped behind the clouds, the ancient stone walls of the central mausoleum shivered like a tired old knight after a night of ale. A chorus of rusted armor clanged and cracked as the Guardians, hooded monks, skeletal knights, and a wailing banshee, filed in through the iron gate, their breath fogging the chilled air. The ground reeked of damp earth and old incense, a perfume that could make a vampire snort in disgust. Lanterns sputtered, casting flickering shadows that danced like jittery tick-tock stars on the gravestones. The whole scene felt like the universe had booked a blackout party and forgot to send the invitation to sanity. Eliska stood at the marble threshold, her heart thudding like a drum solo in a rock concert, while Vodchtek's name echoed in her mind like a forgotten password. She knew the forbidden rite could bind the Guardian's restless souls to the living, granting them power, but at the cost of an eternity of paperwork and bad coffee. Sir Aldrich, clad in tarnished silver and boasting a swagger that would make a medieval peacock blush, sneered at her hesitation. "Save the world, or save your boy," he growled, brandishing a sword that seemed to hum the theme from Star Wars, just without the fancy lightsaber glow. The irony was as thick as the cemetery's moss. A hero forced to choose between a love story and a cosmic horror script. Steel met sorcery in a clash that sounded like a battle between a chainsaw and a choir of bagpipes. Aldrich's blade sliced through the night, sparking off the copper sigils etched into the mausoleum's floor, while Eliska summoned wind that smelled of burnt rosemary and teenage rebellion. The Guardians shouted curses that sounded suspiciously like meme references. "Not today, Satan," echoing off the cracked colonnades. Each strike sent shards of stone raining down like confetti at a very grim wedding, and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood and ozone. Even the moon seemed to giggle, its crimson face winking as if it were the universe's most mischievous director. The battle's fury rattled the ancient foundations, and the mausoleum began to sway like an old ship caught in a hurricane of graveyard gossip. Cracks spider webbed across the marble, releasing dust that smelled of damp rot and forgotten promises. A deafening roar rose as a pillar snapped, sending a cascade of limestone that crashed onto the ceremonial altar, splattering the ritual chalk with a splash that could have been a perfectly timed splash zone at a theme park. The Guardians' chants faltered, turning into a chorus of surprised squeals, as if they'd just realized they'd accidentally walked into a slapstick comedy. Eliska felt the ground tremble under her boots, a reminder that even the dead have a bad sense of timing. When the dust settled, the eclipse waned, and the moon turned a shy pink, the survivors stared at the ruined mausoleum like it was a bad haircut gone public. Aldrich, bruised and oddly humbled, sheathed his sword and muttered an apology that sounded like a line from a sitcom. "Guess we overcooked that one." Eliska cradled Vodchtek, whose pulse fluttered like a trapped moth finally finding the exit, and whispered that love was the truest kind of magic, no spell required. The Guardians dispersed, each disappearing into shadows with a sigh that could be heard as a distant fart in a silent library. And so the cemetery settled back into its eternal gossip, promising that the next eclipse might bring a more sensible ritual, perhaps involving tea and sensible footwear. The first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the crooked headstones, turning the cemetery into a watercolor of sepia and gold. Eliska, clutching the ancient hammer her grandmother had warned her about, stared down at the ritual stone like it owed her rent. With a grin that could rival a mischievous pixie, she swung, and the stone cracked, sending a shower of chalky dust into the cold air. The sound cracked like a cymbal in a haunted orchestra, echoing off moss-covered graves and startling a nearby raven into an accidental jazz solo. In that moment, the stone's ancient sigils melted away, as if the universe had finally hit the undo button on a 1,000-year-old curse. Guardians, once stone statues with granite eyes, shuddered, their limbs rustling like old armor in a wind tunnel. One by one, they peeled away their petrified skins, revealing gaunt, ethereal beings dripping with centuries of soot and wilted lilac perfume. Their laughter cracked the silence, a chorus of squeaky toys meeting a medieval choir, and the air filled with the tang of damp earth and wilted roses. They stretched their newly freed arms, feeling the sunrise on fingertips that hadn't known light since the Black Death. A sly comment escaped a guardian. "Well, that's one way to break a Monday morning meeting," as they glanced at the cracked stone like a broken coffee mug. Vojtek, whose ghostly skin had been glued to the cemetery's night shift like a bad tattoo, felt the warmth surge through his veins as the spell dissolved. He blinked, his eyes no longer glowing like lanterns but milky with lingering sleep, and shivered as a cold wind nudged his shoulders. With a sigh that sounded like a sigh from an old leather sofa, he turned his back on the now peaceful graves, his boots squelching in the damp moss. The path to the iron gate smelled of rust and cheap coffee from the nearby monastery cafe, reminding him that mortality's perks include caffeine and tax returns. He muttered, "Guess I'm off the eternal night shift, back to paying rent and avoiding laundry monsters," and stepped into the waking world. The guardians, still tingling with newfound freedom, rose like mist-clad superheroes, their forms dissolving into the morning fog with a sigh that smelled of incense and old books. Each spirit spiraled upward, leaving behind a faint trail of lavender and mildew, as if the cemetery itself were exhaling after a long, smoky argument. The fog curled around the tombstones, turning their inscriptions into ghostly scripts that the wind tried to read aloud, but only managed a wheezy boo. Somewhere in the distance, a cuckoo clock chimed 12 times, except it was only 9 in the morning, making the whole scene feel like a badly timed sitcom punchline. The final wisp of a guardian winked at Aliska before vanishing, whispering, "Don't forget to water the plants," as the sunrise painted the sky a smug orange. When the mist cleared, the cemetery settled into a hushed reverence, the graves standing as stoic as old librarians who have seen every drama. The broken ritual stone lay in rubble, smelling faintly of crushed chalk and burnt toast, an odd reminder that even legends need a snack break. No longer haunted by vigilant statues, the plots hummed with the subtle buzz of beetles and the occasional snort of a sleepy owl. Yet the tale of the guardians refuses to die. It slithers through the rustling leaves like a mischievous gossip, only heard by those daring enough to listen at dawn. And so, as the sun climbs higher, the silent stones keep their secrets, waiting for the next curious soul to ask, "Did you really just see a ghost flex its muscles?" A question that always earns a chuckle from the wind. The highlands rose like a bruised bruise of fog, each ridge humming with the sigh of ancient rain. Young archivist Alara, clutching a scroll that smelled faintly of mildew and ambition, marched beside Tomas, a mason whose hands were as cracked as the castle stones he'd spent a lifetime shaping. A royal decree, stamped with the king's smug grin, commanded them to catalog every forgotten chamber of Castle Ravenshade. They arrived at the crumbling gate just as the sun tried to peek through the clouds, only to be shooed away by a flock of crows that squawked like a medieval dubstep remix. Even the wind seemed to whisper, "Welcome to the ghost tour you never signed up for." The courtyard was a graveyard of broken tiles, each one half eaten by moss that smelled like old cheese left out in a cellar. Tomas slapped a palm-sized stone against the doorway, and it echoed like a drum roll from a forgotten theater, while Alara recorded the reverberation in her notebook, noting the timbre as dramatically ominous. Inside, the air tasted of cold iron and damp wool, as if 100 laundry days had decided to hibernate in the same space. Cobwebs draped the arches like lazy curtains, trembling when a stray mouse scurried by, sending a shiver up Alara's spine that rivaled the thrill of a first-time roller coaster rider. They began their catalog, sketching each arch and labeling every graffiti like rune, all the while Tomas muttering that the stones were older than his grandmother's gossip column. Midway through the south wing, a faint draft slipped from a wall that should have been solid, like a secret sigh begging to be heard. Alara knelt, brushed away centuries of grime, and uncovered a rusted iron ring that hummed with the promise of a sealed crypt. Together they heaved the massive stone slab, dislodging a cloud of stale incense and bat droppings that clung to their noses like a bad perfume. The crypt yawned open, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow even the light, while Tomas whispered, "Looks like someone really needed a privacy shield." Inside, the walls were lined with skeletal chandeliers, each crystal dripping with condensation that sounded like a chorus of tiny sobbing ghosts. Staggering into the crypt's heart, they discovered a faded tapestry hanging limp on a cracked loom, its colors faded to the hue of a Netflix "Are you still watching?" screen. The tapestry depicted a snarling dragon, its scales rendered with such detail that even the most seasoned dragon slayer from Game of Thrones would raise an eyebrow. Alara traced the embroidered fire with a fingertip, feeling the rough thread like sandpaper on a medieval Instagram filter. An ironic caption, embroidered in Latin, read Cave Draconum, "Beware the dragon," as if the weaver anticipated future tourists needing a spoiler alert. A faint crack in the fabric let a whiff of moldy pine drift out, reminding them that even legendary beasts can't escape the scent of old woodwork. Whispers among the castle's ghosts claimed a hidden vault, tucked behind the tapestry, once cradling the kingdom's lost crown. Tomas, eyes glittering like a kid spotting a candy stash, jabbed the wall with his chisel, eliciting a hollow thunk that sounded suspiciously like a drum solo from a 1980s rock band. A secret panel slid aside, revealing a narrow stairwell slick with mildew that tasted of stale beer and regret. At the bottom, a modest wooden chest waited, its lid covered in a coat of dust so thick it could have served as a winter coat for a yeti. When they lifted the lid, instead of glimmering gold, they found a tarnished iron tiara, the crown's twin that had been cursed to look like a budget Halloween prop. Alara laughed, noting that the kingdom's greatest treasure might just be the story they'd now tell, while Tomas muttered that at least the tiara didn't need polishing, unlike his reputation. Alara slipped the torch from her belt and pressed it to the damp stone wall, while Tomas followed with a grin that said, "I hope we don't find any surprise roommates." The lower dungeons yawned beneath them like a forgotten cellar, reeking of mildew and ancient cheese, if a cheese had been left to rot for centuries. Their boots splashed through puddles that sounded like squeaky rubber ducks, echoing off the vaulted arches. Every step seemed to stir a chorus of distant drips, as if the castle itself were breathing out stale air. Midway down, a series of glyphs caught their eye, crude, angular symbols that formed the emblem of a brotherhood of scholars long erased from the history books. Ilara traced the carvings with a fingertip, whispering, "Looks like they liked secret clubs more than Facebook." Tomas nudged a stone slab, and the wall sighed open, revealing a narrow passage as dark as a binge-watch marathon without subtitles. The glyphs glowed faintly, their meaning as cryptic as a meme that only insiders get. A cold draft rushed out, smelling like old parchment and a hint of iron, as if the passage were exhaling centuries of unanswered questions. The lanterns flickered to life, casting trembling light on a stone altar that sat like a relic from a medieval IKEA catalog. Upon it lay a bronze key, dull yet gleaming, its surface etched with swirling patterns that reminded Tomas of a dragon tattoo gone wrong. The air around the altar smelled of cold metal and the faint, sweet rot of forgotten herbs, making Ilara's nose twitch in warning. As she reached for the key, a sudden tremor rattled the stone, and tiny dust motes performed a frantic dance like paparazzi at a celebrity entrance. Their heartbeat drummed in their ears, louder than any battle anthem. Before they could savor the prize, the tunnel behind them shuddered and collapsed with a roar that could rival a dragon's sneeze. Rubble rained down, sealing the exit and forcing the duo into a panic-induced sprint through a maze of forgotten corridors. The walls were lined with skeletal remains, ribcages cracked like old bottle caps and skulls grinning as if they just heard the worst joke ever. Each bone emitted a stale, sour odor reminiscent of a gym bag left in the sun for a month, making Tomas gag and Ilara gaggle a nervous chuckle. Along the way, cryptic runes glowed faintly, spelling out warnings in a language that sounded like a medieval Wi-Fi password. No entry for mortals. With no way back, Ilara hoisted herself onto a jagged ledge, using the bronze key as a makeshift hook, while Tomas followed, slipping like a cat on a marble floor. The ascent felt like climbing a greasy slide at an amusement park, each grab accompanied by the squelch of damp earth and the occasional clatter of a stray bone hitting the stone. When they finally emerged into a shaft of pale moonlight, the castle's silhouette loomed like a giant's coat rack, and the key pulsed in Ilara's palm as if it were a tiny, disgruntled dragon. They stared at each other, half exhausted, half amazed, realizing that the forgotten brotherhood had left them a clue, and a very inconveniently placed souvenir, right where they needed it most. They burst from the cold, slime-slick tunnels into the great hall, the sound of their heavy boots echoing like a medieval drumline. The torches sputter, casting jittery shadows that dance across tapestries depicting dragons with suspiciously modern eyebrows. A whiff of stale dampness and old incense fills their nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from a recent skirmish. Their hearts pound in sync with the ancient stone, as if the castle itself were holding its breath. Even the cobwebs seem to whisper, "Welcome back, you two. The drama's just getting good." In the center of the hall, they spot the bronze key, no bigger than a dragon's claw, glinting under a cascade of dust. When Lena runs her fingers over its engravings, the symbols click into place like the final pieces of a jigsaw puzzle from a particularly snobby puzzle box. The key, they discover, is merely a fragment of a massive map etched into the very floorboards, the lines shifting like a living Google Maps route. As they scrape away centuries of grime, the outline of hidden chambers and forgotten passages emerges, shimmering with a promise of untold loot. The moment feels as epic as the moment Darth Vader discovers his son's hidden Jedi holocron. If Vader were a castle-loving archaeologist, of course. Just as they marvel at the revelation, a sleek silhouette slides into the hall. Kale, the rival treasure hunter with a reputation as sticky as the castle's mildew. He flashes a grin that could melt stone, brandishing a pistol that looks like it was borrowed from a Renaissance-themed video game. "Nice map you've got there," he drawls, the sarcasm thick enough to cut through the musty air. "But I'm afraid it belongs to me." The room crackles with tension, the kind you feel when you're about to step on a Lego brick left by an angry child. After a standoff that feels like a medieval version of a reality TV showdown, they lock eyes, each realizing the stakes are higher than a dragon's ego at a knight's banquet. A low rumble shudders through the stone, and the chandeliers sway like nervous contestants on a game show. The earth splits with an abrupt crack, revealing a yawning fissure that exhales a hot, iron-scented breath, reminiscent of a dragon's sneeze after a spicy taco. Both parties gasp, then half laugh, because nothing says teamwork like sharing a terrifyingly fresh sinkhole. Kale, ever the opportunist, proposes a truce. "We survive this, we split the treasure. If we die, at least we'll go out with style." The alliance is as fragile as a spider's silk thread, yet it holds, humming with the promise of deeper mysteries below. They pause at the brink of the newly revealed fissure, the stone trembling like a cat on a hot tin roof. A sudden tremor shakes the dust from ancient banners, releasing a stale, metallic scent that reminds Lena of a medieval blacksmith's workshop after a marathon forging session. The fissure yawns wider, its darkness swallowing the torchlight and promising a descent into the castle's very belly. Think Inception meets Game of Thrones, but with more cobwebs and fewer dragons. Kale, eyes glittering with the same greedy sparkle that once led pirates to chase the fountain of youth, extends a tentative hand, his voice dripping with irony. "Looks like we're forced to cooperate, unless you fancy becoming a permanent part of the castle's daycare." The duo shares a wary grin, their uneasy alliance cemented by the rumble of the earth, and together they step into the abyss, ready to unearth secrets that have slumbered longer than a bored medieval bard's lullaby. With the final piece of the ancient map clutched like a treasure map in a pirate film, Alara, Tomas, and Kale slipped down the moss-slick stone steps. The air grew colder with each footfall, a damp breath that smelled of earth and forgotten incense. Their lanterns flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced like nervous sprites on the walls. Somewhere deeper, a low hum throbbed, as if the castle itself were humming a bedtime lullaby for giants. The trio exchanged nervous grins. Tomas whispered, "If this is a trap, at least it's got good acoustics." At the bottom of the shaft, they entered a cavern so vast it made the great hall look like a broom closet. A massive stone dragon coiled around a pulsing crystal, its scales glittering like cracked obsidian under the lantern light. The crystal, known in legend as the dragon's heart, beat with a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a bass drop in a medieval rave. A sweet, metallic scent drifted from it, mingling with the musty odor of wet stone and distant echo of dripping water. Kale, ever the skeptic, muttered, "Great, we've stumbled onto a Jurassic pet rock." Alara stepped forward, her hands trembling as she brushed the crystal's surface, which flared brighter than a sunrise over a battlefield. Suddenly the stone dragon's eyes ignited, amber fire blazing like the eyes of a grumpy dragon from an anime opening. The ground trembled, sending a cascade of dust that smelled like stale ale and ancient parchment. Tomas shouted, "Hold onto your helmets, folks! This thing's got more attitude than a sassy AI." The dragon's stone ribs creaked, and the entire chamber seemed to inhale, as if preparing to roar. Etched into a slab beside the beast was a riddle written in old tongue, each line curling like a cat on a windowsill. "I am the keeper of fire, yet I never burn. Speak my name and I shall return." Kale squinted, then cracked a grin. "Sounds like my mother when she asks why I'm still single." Alara whispered dragon, and the stone eyes dimmed, the amber glow receding like a Netflix series after the finale. The dragon's massive head lowered, allowing the crystal to be lifted without a single groan from the stone giant. With the dragon's heart cradled like a newborn phoenix, the trio stumbled back up, slipping on slime that smelled like old socks in a locker room. The tunnel seemed to applaud with a faint echo, a ghostly applause that made Tomas feel like he'd just won an Oscar for Best Supporting Adventurer. Alara wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, remarking, "Now we just need to find a way to charge my phone with this thing." As they emerged into the castle's courtyard, the sunrise painted the stone walls gold, and the dragon's silhouette faded into legend once more. The sunken chamber, satisfied, settled back into silence, promising that any future treasure hunters would have to bring better jokes. The daylight cracked like a fresh egg as the party burst through the gloom, the dragon's heart pulsing a fierce blue that painted the cavern walls in neon. Its light sliced through centuries of dust, coaxing a hidden seam to hiss open, a vault door that had never known a sunrise. When the stone shivered, a musty breath of ancient incense and damp stone spilled out, as if the castle itself were yawning awake. Our heroes stepped onto the surface, boots squelching in mud that smelled of moss and old secrets, and the vault's interior glimmered with the crown's ghostly outline. Even the squirrels on the nearby oak seemed to pause, blinking at the spectacle like extra-legged paparazzi at a celebrity gala. Inside the vaulted chamber, the lost royal crown lay atop a velvet cushion, its golden arches dulled by time but still humming with regal swagger. Alara lifted it, feeling the cold metal bite her palm like a mischievous cat, while the faint scent of rosemary and rust, remnants of forgotten feasts, filled the air. The throne room erupted in a chorus of trumpets that sounded suspiciously like a brass section from a 1980s action movie, echoing off stone arches. King Aldrin's line, long extinct, seemed to reappear in the flicker of torchlight, each facet of the crown catching fire like a disco ball in the medieval age. When the crown settled upon the ancient seat, the hall vibrated with a low hum, as if the very stones were giving a standing ovation. The Brotherhood's scribes, who had been hoarding parchment like dragons hoarding gold, finally unrolled their chronicles and let the ink flow onto fresh pages. Their quills scratched with a rhythm that could rival a drum solo, releasing aromas of fresh parchment, candle wax, and the occasional whiff of spilled ale from the banquet hall. Villagers gathered, eyes wide as gullible tourists at a haunted house, to hear tales of hidden tunnels, enchanted armor, and the legendary dragon's heart being used as a flashlight. Laughter bubbled as the chroniclers recounted the moment Kale tried to convince a stone statue to do the Macarena, only to be shooed away by a grumpy gargoyle. The printed chronicles, now bound in leather that smelled of cedar and adventure, would travel far beyond the castle walls, turning the old stones into a viral legend. Think medieval tick-tock, but with more parchment. Alara stood before the newly revealed vault, her eyes reflecting the crown's glint and a resolve as sharp as a freshly honed blade. She swore on the dragon's fire to guard the secrets, promising to keep the vault's scent of ancient earth and stale incense from falling into greedy hands. The wind whispered through the battlements, carrying the metallic tang of blood from past battles and the sweet perfume of blooming nightshade that grew in the courtyard. She placed a simple iron key, engraved with a tiny rune of protection, into a tiny slot, like a lock on a diary that only she could open, even if the key smelled faintly of rust and pine resin. With a grin as sly as a fox in a henhouse, she declared that the castle would now have the best security system since the invention of the moat, complete with surveillance ravens that gossip more than any courtier. Cale, his cloak billowing like a superhero cape, tipped his hat and slipped into the shadows, his boots leaving a trail of mud that squelched like a bad joke. He paused at the doorway, eyes twinkling with the promise of future collabs, as if saying, "I'll be back before you can finish your tea." The castle's stone walls seemed to sigh, perhaps relieved that his clumsy charm would not forever echo through the corridors. As he vanished into the forest, a lone owl hooted, sounding suspiciously like a distant Wi-Fi router rebooting, nature's own notification that the adventure isn't over. The heroes watched him go, feeling a mix of melancholy and excitement, knowing that the next chapter would be as thrilling as a dragon-riding roller coaster. Mara trudged up the ragged cliffs of Blackrock, the wind howling like a bored metal band backstage. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its stone silhouette stitched against a sky the color of old bruises. Salt stung her nostrils, and the sea below churned in frothy spite, flickering like a jittery tick-tock filter. She clutched the rust-caked key the previous keeper had slipped into her palm, feeling the weight of centuries press into her palm. With a sigh that could have been a sigh of relief or a sarcastic eye roll at the drama, she stepped into the lighthouse's yawning maw. Inside, the walls wore the scars of forgotten voyages. Names of vanished ships were chiseled deep into the cold limestone, each letter a ghostly scar. HMS Penumbra, the siren's lament, and a half-eroded SS-42 Oops stared back at her, the last one apparently a misprint from an overworked scribe. The air smelled of damp wool and the faint, sour tang of seaweed that had been stuck to the stone for who knows how long. Mara brushed a hand across a particularly fresh engraving, feeling the roughness of the tool marks, and a chill skittered up her forearm like a cat burglar in a horror movie. She whispered a joke about the lighthouse having better record-keeping than her own dating app, and the stone seemed to snicker in return. Just as she turned a corner, a mournful wail slithered through the corridors, echoing like a choir of lost sailors stuck on an endless loop of a bad karaoke night. The phantom crew emerged from the shadows, their forms semi-transparent, dressed in tattered uniforms that smelled of brine and old gunpowder. Their captain, a gaunt figure with a beard tangled like seaweed, gestured dramatically, as if demanding Mara audition for Pirates of the Caribbean 7, the Lighthouse Revenge. The sound was a blend of creaking timber, distant gulls, and a low, mournful hum that could have been a whale singing the national anthem of an underwater kingdom. Mara laughed, half in terror and half, because she imagined the ghostly crew demanding her to polish their antique sextant, and the whale seemed to wobble with amusement. The lighthouse, it seemed, was a stubborn old-timer, refusing to let the sea forget its stories, binding stone to surf like a stubborn Wi-Fi connection that never truly drops. Each gust of wind rattled the lantern, throwing flickering shadows that danced like jittery tick-tock dances across the floor, while the phantom crew muttered sea shanties that sounded suspiciously like the chorus of "We Will Rock You" if a pirate sang it. Mara felt the fortress pulse beneath her boots, the very stones humming with the restless energy of shipwrecks, broken promises, and the occasional seagull's scream that could slice through a thunderstorm. She realized the lighthouse wasn't just a beacon for ships, but a stubborn reminder that the past refuses to stay buried, especially when it smells like rotting fish and old ink. With a wry grin, she declared, "Fine, you win. I'll be the night's DJ." And the ghosts gave a chorus of claps that sounded like rain on a tin roof. As the night deepened, the mist curled around the cliffs like a lazy cat, and Mara settled into the keeper's chair, the wood creaking under her weight like an old pirate's laugh. The phantom crew gathered around the lantern, their ethereal faces lit by a glow that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the crashing waves. Mara pulled out a battered notebook, scribbling the engraved names with a quill that squeaked louder than a squeaky toy in a silent library. She whispered a promise to honor each ghostly vessel, promising to keep the light burning brighter than a Netflix binge-watch session. With that oath, the lighthouse's beams swept across the sea, a silver spear that cut through the fog, binding Mara's fate to the restless tide for all eternity. Mara trudged down the jagged cliffs of Fort Corvid, her boots splashing through salty brine and the scent of rotting kelp. Beside her shuffled Tomas, a grizzled fisherman whose beard smelled like a fish market after a hurricane, and whose jokes were as stale as the ship biscuits he hoarded. Above the wreck of the eldritch dawn, ghostly lanterns flickered in a rhythm that made even the gulls hush and stare, their phosphorescent glow turning the night sea into a neon rave for the dead. The wind howled like an old pirate shanty, rattling the fortress walls and tugging at Mara's coat, while Tomas muttered, "If I wanted a light show, I'd have gone to Vegas, not a cursed shipyard." Together they stared at the wreck, feeling the chill of centuries-old secrets crawling up their spines. They launched their creaky skiff, the wood groaning under Tomas's weight, while the ocean sprayed them with a briny mist that tasted of iron and old fishbones. As they neared the eldritch dawn, a low, mournful hum seeped from the hull, like a bass line from a haunted synthwave track, and a translucent figure materialized at the helm Captain Vane, looking like the grumpiest Disney villain ever to wield a cutlass. Vane's eyes glowed amber, flickering with a mix of fury and disappointment, as though someone had stolen his treasure and also his favorite episode of Game of Thrones. Tomas, never one to miss a punchline, whispered, "I guess this captain really can't see the humor in this," causing Mara to smirk despite the chill crawling up her arms. The spectral captain raised a ghostly saber, and the water around the wreck began to pulse with an eerie, tidal rhythm. Mara leaned closer, her breath fogging in the night, and realized that Vane's vengeance was anchored to a chest of gold that never left the ship's belly, a loot of cursed doubloons that glimmered like 1,000 tick-tock likes. The chest emitted a low, humming pulse that made the sea foam fizz, releasing a metallic tang that made Mara's tongue feel like it was licking a battery. With each flash of the ghostly lanterns, the captain's voice rose, a rasp that sounded like an ancient MP3 player stuck on repeat, demanding repayment for the theft of his treasure. Tomas, ever pragmatic, muttered, "Well, if he's looking for his loot, maybe we should just send him a Venmo request. Ghosts love fast money, right?" Yet beneath the humor, the air thrummed with a tangible threat, as if the ocean itself were tightening its grip around the doomed hull. Back at the fortress, the ancient stone walls began to shudder with every spectral tide, each tremor sounding like the groaning of a colossal, sleeping beast. Dust rose from the mortar, swirling like a ghostly confetti parade, while the smell of damp moss and rusted cannonballs seeped into the corridors, making Mara's nose twitch with both disgust and intrigue. The watchtower's iron shutters clanged together, performing a rhythm that reminded Tomas of the Macarena, a dance the dead clearly never mastered. Rats fled in panicked squeaks, their tiny paws skittering over the cold flagstones, while the lighthouse's beam flickered, as if trying to keep up with the capricious specters. The whole fort seemed to breathe, exhaling ancient curses, and Mara felt the weight of history pressing against her, equal parts awe and a sudden urge to grab a popcorn bucket. Determined not to become another ghostly souvenir, Mara hatched a plan that blended cunning with a dash of absurdity. She'd lure Captain Vane with a decoy chest stuffed with glittering sea glass and a copy of the latest pirate meme. Yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum Netflix. Tomas chuckled, slapping his knee, and added, "If we can't beat him, we can at least make him meme-worthy." As they set the trap, the fortress walls rattled one last time, echoing like a drum roll before a grand finale, while the tide rose with a booming roar that sounded suspiciously like the line, "Who you gonna call?" The air crackled with anticipation, the smell of brine mixing with the sweet scent of victory, and Mara felt a grin spreading across her face, ready to outwit a cursed captain with humor, heart, and a splash of pop culture flair. When the tide swallows the cliffs of Drifthold each midnight, the townsfolk whisper of the tide-bound covenant like a bedtime story for hard-drinking sailors. The sky roars with bruised clouds, and the salty wind smells of old fish and fresh secrets. Lanterns flicker on the weather-worn pier, casting trembling shadows that dance like jittery ghosts. In that dim glow, elders pull out a crusty scroll, its ink smeared with seawater and a hint of kelp, promising the ocean its due in exchange for safe harbors. The original pact was sealed the day a leviathan, half whale-sized ego, rose from the abyss to demand tribute. Villagers tossed barrels of dried cod, clinking metal coins, and a massive barnacle-covered shell that sang when the waves struck it. The beast answered with a low, resonant growl that vibrated through fishermen's boots, sending shivers down spines like an unexpected spoiler for a superhero movie. As the beast doused the shore with a spray of brine, the crowd cheered, half terrified, half relieved that their seafood was still on the menu. Years later, a storm the size of a rogue Netflix binge-watch marathon slammed the coast, and the sea seemed intent on overturning the very covenant. Rain hammered the rooftops like angry drums, and the scent of wet mud mingled with the stench of rotting seaweed, nature's own perfume of chaos. The townspeople huddled in the tavern, sipping grog and debating whether to call upon the Leviathan or simply blame the weather like a sitcom character blames bad Wi-Fi. Ironically, the storm's fury reminded everyone that the sea, much like a reality TV plot twist, loves a good drama. Enter Finn, the flounder, McGill, a fisherman whose nickname was as dubious as his luck at catching anything but gossip. He waddled to the shoreline with a rusted trident that squeaked louder than a squeaky toy in a quiet library, his boots squelching in the muck. With a grin that suggested he just survived a pirate raid in a bathtub, Finn shouted a defiant oath to the deep, promising to pay the levy with a fresh haul of sardines and a side of sarcasm. The sea roared back, not with anger but with a hint of amusement, as if the ocean itself were chuckling at Finn's audacity. By the break of dawn, the storm had retreated, leaving behind a glittering carpet of sea glass and the lingering aroma of ozone mixed with fried fish. The Leviathan, now looking less ominous and more like an overstyled celebrity cameo, accepted Finn's tribute with a slow, approving nod. The covenant was renewed, inked again on that ancient scroll, now annotated with a doodle of a fish wearing sunglasses, proof that even ancient agreements need a little humor. As the villagers celebrated, the tide hummed a low lullaby, and the salty air tasted like victory, brine, and the faint promise of another saga on the horizon. The sky bled violet as the lunar eclipse reached its apex, draping the coastline in an eerie twilight. Mara tightened the rope around her waist, feeling the salty sting of spray hiss against her cheek like a sarcastic sea spray critique. Beside her, Tomas cracked a grin, muttering that even Poseidon would need a flashlight to find his lost sock in this gloom. Together they slipped through the cracked arch of the submerged cavern, where kelp swayed like ghostly curtains and the water smelled of barnacles and old brine. Their lanterns flickered, casting jittery shadows that danced like nervous paparazzi around the ancient stone. At the cavern's heart loomed Captain Vane's wraith, a translucent corsair still wearing his battered tricorn and a scowl that could curdle milk. The specter raised a rusted cutlass that glowed with a pale, moon-kissed fire, slicing the water in slow motion, as if auditioning for a ballet of doom. Mara lunged, her blade humming like a 90s power chord, while Tomas hurled a net of phosphorescent algae that smelled oddly of cheese puffs. Light collided with darkness, sparking a chorus of clashing steel and ghostly wails that echoed off the cavern walls like a badly tuned organ. The wraith snarled, "You think a pearl can beat a curse?" and vanished in a puff of sea foam, leaving a lingering scent of wet parchment. From the abyss rose the angry sea specters, swarms of translucent fish like apparitions that hissed and spluttered, their eyes glowing like busted neon signs. They surged forward, their bodies pulsing with brine-soaked fury, slamming into the heroes with the force of a rogue wave at a beach party. Tomas swung his lantern like a medieval lead torch, the light scorching the specters into frothy suds that fizzed and smelled like stale soda. Mara's sword sang, cleaving through phantom tentacles that left a taste of copper on her tongue and a faint echo of distant sea shanties. The cavern trembled. Droplets of water drummed on stone like 1,000 frantic drummers, while the battle turned into a chaotic tango of luminescence and shadow. In the maelstrom, Mara spotted the relic, a pearl of moonlit glass perched atop an altar of coral, shimmering like a Hollywood Oscar made of seawater. She snatched it, feeling the cool bite of the stone against her palm, and with a desperate leap hurled it toward the beating heart of the wraith's remnants. The pearl exploded in a blinding cascade of silvery light, shattering the curse into 1,000 glittering shards that sang like a choir of retired superheroes. The cavern flooded with a perfume of jasmine and ozone, while the specters dissolved in a hiss that sounded oddly like a sigh of relief after a really bad movie. Yet the brilliance also struck Tomas, searing his forearm with a sting colder than a freezer aisle, reminding everyone that fireworks come with a price tag. As the light dimmed, the cavern fell into a hushed silence, broken only by the distant crash of waves and the faint groan of the stone altar creaking like an old pirate's chair. Mara cradled the shattered pearl shards, realizing the curse was lifted, but the cost was Tomas's lost sight in his right eye, now a black, stormy pool. Tomas laughed through the pain, joking that he'd finally get to see things the way he always wanted, through a dramatic pirate's monologue. The duo emerged from the water, dripping and salty, the moon now a thin sliver that winked at them like a mischievous child. And as they walked back toward the rusted fortress, the sea sang a lullaby of gratitude, promising that any future hauntings would need better PR than a midnight showdown. When Mara slammed the ancient crystal into the lantern's heart, the lighthouse erupted in a blue-white flare that could outshine a 4th of July fireworks show. The Phantom Fleet, a wavering line of translucent hulls, shivered and dissolved into the mist like bad Wi-Fi signal lost in a storm. Salty spray that once tasted of iron and thunder now smelled faintly of seaweed tea, and the wind sighed in relief, humming a lullaby the ocean had forgotten. Even the gulls, those feathered gossip columns, quieted their raucous cries, as if they too were waiting for the curtain to drop. The sea, previously a frothing beast, settled into a glassy mirror that reflected the first stars of evening. With the spectral armada gone, the ancient stone fortress yawned awake, its stone walls stretching like a weathered dragon's spine. Mara, now a seasoned keeper with more sea-scraped scars than hair, marched along the ramparts, her boots crunching on centuries-old sand that smelled of brine and old campfires. She tightened the iron hinges of the main gate, each clang echoing like a drumbeat in an epic fantasy film. Think Lord of the Rings meets a pirate tavern night. The once echoing corridors, haunted by phantom footfalls, now rang with the soft murmur of her notebook pages turning. The scent of fresh pine, oil from the lantern rooms, mingled with the lingering ozone, promising a future built on steadier tides. Mara settled at the great oak desk, its surface scarred by generations of ink spills and spilled rum, and began to ink the legend for posterity. She scribbled with a quill fashioned from a pelican feather, letting each stroke taste of salt and ink, a flavor that reminded her of childhood seafaring tales. Between anecdotes of ghost ships and jokes about how even undead sailors need good Wi-Fi, she slipped in a cheeky nod to modern pop culture. Even the specters would have needed Netflix to binge-watch their own drama. Her candle sputtered, casting dancing shadows that looked suspiciously like the Phantom Fleet's former hulls, turning the room into a cheap haunted house attraction. The act of recording felt like stitching a quilt of memory, each patch a vivid scene that would warm future listeners on cold, storm-racked nights. The specters of the sea, once feared as omens of doom, now sit politely in Mara's stories like polite strangers at a tea party, still impressive, but no longer terrifying. Children who wander the cliffs will hear her tales, giggle at the irony that a ghost fleet vanished because of a misplaced crystal, and perhaps imagine the ships as the universe's version of a bad haircut that finally gets fixed. The fortress, no longer a brooding sentinel, hums with the low thrum of daily life. Clang of blacksmiths, shouts of fishmongers, and the occasional off-key sea shanty that sounds like a karaoke night on a pirate ship. Even the wind seems to whisper, "Yo, keep it chill," like an ancient sea god sending a text message in the language of breezes. In this new era, the ocean's roar becomes a backdrop, not a threat, much like background music in a superhero movie, exciting, but never overpowering the hero's dialogue. As dusk drapes its violet shawl over the horizon, the lighthouse's beam sweeps across the calm water, painting silver ribbons that dance with the gentle sigh of waves. Mara stands atop the highest balcony, feeling the cool kiss of night air on her cheeks, and lets out a laugh that mingles with distant gull cries, an ode to survival, irony, and a dash of cosmic humor. She knows that tomorrow's tide will bring new stories, perhaps of merchants who forget to tip the keeper, or of tourists mistaking the lighthouse for a giant selfie stick. Yet she also understands that the greatest treasure isn't gold or jewels, but the peace that settles when a phantom fleet finally says, "We're out! Thanks for the cleanup." With a satisfied sigh, she closes her notebook, the page whispering like a satisfied sea foam sigh, and the fortress settles into its new, tranquil rhythm.